They say you still weep for the woman you lost. What was her name again? Her name is not for your mouth.
I had heard these exact words before. The same low couch, the same narrow apartment in Hangzhou, the same cup of tea going cold on the same chipped saucer. Across from me sat Yao Qian and her mother Shu Li, and the mother was telling me, again, to buy a house near West Lake, to get a stable career with room to advance, or to quietly step out of her daughter's life. I had heard this speech once already, every syllable, every pause, every little twist of the knife, not in a dream, not in a memory, in a life, a whole life ago. I remembered the exact angle of the floor under my knees when I begged her the first time. I remembered the color of the ceiling I stared at as I died in a gutter outside a roadside bar that same night. I remembered, more clearly than any of that, what I had become in the long, strange years between that death and this tea. Somewhere in the private place behind my sternum, I kept a single memory folded, like a letter I had not finished writing. I would not unfold it now. I had not earned the right yet. What I had earned, after 2 lives of learning, was the right to not beg in this one. Everything else would follow from that. I had woken up here, tea still warm, Shu Li still talking. I let her finish. She had worked up to her favorite line, that I was mud and Sun Gone was clouds, and that her daughter deserved clouds. She wore the same jade bracelet and the same expensive chapao as the first time. She enjoyed this speech. I had studied her face for a long moment in my first life and failed to understand her. In my second life, I understood her perfectly. She was a small animal that had mistaken a sleeping dragon for a worm. I told her she was short-sighted. I told her there were many medicines sold in this world, but no medicine for regret. And I told her quietly that one day she would kneel at my door begging me for forgiveness. And on that day, I would watch her leave without lifting a finger. Yao Qian stared at me like I had grown a second face. I think for a moment, she thought I had already learned about Sun Gone. Then I said his name, and the color in her cheeks finished whatever I had started. I asked her how long. She did not answer. She did not have to. I stood up. I set the teacup down carefully so it would not ring against the saucer. I walked out of that apartment without another word, and I did not look back because the afternoon I had rehearsed once was finally over. I walked to West Lake. It was the densest pocket of spiritual ki left in this city, and I had nothing in my body worth calling cultivation. A primordial spirit in ruins, meridians scrubbed clean, a soft mortal frame with soft mortal bones. I sat on a rock at the back of the mountain, and I began the immortal realm breathing technique. The ki came slow, thin, strained through modern air like water through a filthy cloth, but it came. A faint white vortex formed above the crown of my head, and for the first time in the longest time of either of my lives, I breathed. A voice interrupted me. An old man, stooped, polite, apologetic for disturbing me. He introduced himself as Su Hongyuan, a name I knew. Head of the Su family, chairman of Su Group, one of the largest conglomerates in the Hangzhou-Huzhou Delta. Behind him was a younger woman with a composed face and a spine like a steel rod, and the old man's bodyguard, and all 3 of them were looking at the mist above my head with the cautious expression of mortals who have just noticed a dragon in a teacup. The granddaughter, Su Shui, made the mistake of saying something dismissive about me under her breath. I let the remark pass. The bodyguard did not. He walked toward me with the stance of a man used to settling things with his hands. I flicked a pebble. I aimed for the calf. The bone broke with a dry snap that made Su Hua flinch, and her grandfather go very still. The bodyguard was on the ground pleading before I had uncrossed my legs. I could have left. I did not. I looked at the old man, and I saw, under his skin, the shape of a decades-old wound. A thread of black yin fiendish ki coiled through the space below his heart, like a worm in a fruit, incurable by any modern doctor. A week from killing him, maybe 2. I told him what he had. I told him I could cure it. I told him there would be a price. He agreed before I finished the sentence. I wrote out a list of medicinal herbs, rare ones, the kind you had to know the Jiangnan Mountains to find, and I wrote down my address. I let a thread of spirit yang qi into his fengmen, point, to buy him the days he needed. I walked away. Behind me, I heard him tell his granddaughter he had met a divine being. I kept walking. Divine being was the wrong word. What I was, in that week, was a beggar with a single piece of cargo to sell, and I had just found my buyer. 2 days later, Su Hongyuan came to my rental door with 3 brocade boxes and a bowed head. Every herb on my list, to the gram. I did not inspect them. I could smell their authenticity from across the room. I took him into the bedroom, and I laid him down, and I channeled spirit yang qi through his meridians, and set a small clean flame against the black thing inside him. It burned. He coughed up a mouthful of black blood with black gas curling out of it, and he coughed up another, and an hour later, the hair at his temples had gone from white to half black, and the lines around his eyes had softened by 10 years. He sat up a different man. His granddaughter wept. His bodyguard could not speak. He pressed a key into my hand and a folder along with it. The key was to the best villa at Qinglong Manor, a hilltop property overlooking Hangzhou, a feng shui node the old Jiangnan families had fought over for a century. The folder was an honorary chairmanship of Su Group. I did not accept the villa for the view. Qinglong Manor's geography sat at a convergence of 5 natural spirit veins. It was the only site in 100 kilometers where I could build the spirit gathering array I needed for the next leg of my cultivation. I did not accept the chairmanship for the money either. I accepted it because the Su family's corporate apparatus would give me the cover I needed to operate without attracting the kind of attention a man refining pills out of a rental apartment tends to attract. I told him I would consider it a favor I owed the Su family, one I intended to repay in full. He did not understand what I meant. He would, in time. On my way back to the rental that afternoon, I passed Sun Gan and Yao Qian, arm in arm, by the lake. Sun Gan was loud with his new apartment and his new girl and his old grudge. He called me a loser. He called me trash. Yao Qian watched her shoes. I did not slow my pace. I did not look at him. As I walked past, I formed a small hand seal at my side, a spell I had written in my first life for use on demons too stupid to fear me. It was a mercy that my key reserves were depleted from treating Su Hongyuan, because at full strength, this spell emptied a man's soul into the void. At reduced strength, it simply showed him the void for 3 seconds. Sun Gan saw a river of blood and shattered eyeballs and demon faces reaching for him, and when he came back to his body, he was on his knees with his forehead bleeding against the pavement and yellow liquid running down his trousers. I kept walking. Later that week, he hired thugs, a dozen of them, led by a local gang broker, the Hangzhou underworld, called Brother Rat. They broke my door at dusk, shouting about breaking my legs. I was sitting in my room at that exact moment, completing the final cycle of a breakthrough that had been 3 Earth weeks in the making. I felt my chi reconnect like a hand closing around a handle. Foundation establishment. I crossed the threshold back into cultivation as the first thug kicked a chair across the floor. I did not rise from my seat to deal with them. A cultivator at Foundation establishment controls the pressure in a room the way Immortal controls his breath. I took one breath, and every thug in my apartment was on the floor. The leader, I kept conscious. I stepped on his arm with less force than a grown man uses to open a jar, and his bone folded, and he gave me a name so fast he nearly gave me 2. Sun Gan, the Sun Heir, the deputy personnel manager at Su Group. I told him to go back to his boss and tell him that the man he had sent them to break was unharmed and unamused. I walked into Su Group headquarters the next morning. Sun Gan saw me in the lobby. He did not yet know what had happened to his thugs. He waved over the security captain and told him to throw me out like garbage. The captain, a retired elite soldier with the careful eyes of a man who had learned to survive under orders he disagreed with, approached me politely. He was sorry. He was only doing his job. Would I please cooperate? I looked past him at Sun Gan. I walked 3 steps forward and I slapped him once, open-handed, and he went down like laundry falling from a line. Yao Qian was with him. Of course she was. She screamed at me about our breakup, as if that were what mattered in the room. I did not answer her. I did not have to. The elevator opened and Su Shui walked out, and her expression when she saw me was the expression of a woman recognizing a dragon in its own sky. She walked past Sun Gan without looking at him. She apologized to me with every step. She told the security captain, loudly enough for the lobby to hear, that Sun Gan was fired. Effective that moment. Sun Gan, bleeding at the mouth, tried to invoke his father's shareholder status. Su Hui told him, without raising her voice, that today's board meeting had been called to appoint Mr. Lin as the new honorary chairman and senior consultant of Su Group. She said it the way you state the weather, and she said it where Yao Qian could hear it. I did not look at Yao Qian. I walked to the elevator. Su Shui walked behind me. The boardroom was full. Sun Gan's father was there, Sun Shenghui, a mid-weight shareholder with a nose for wind direction. He had already been on the phone with his son, and he had already understood that his son had just tried to throw the new honorary chairman out of the building for being poorly dressed. Su Hongyuan proposed me. The vote was unanimous in the way these votes always are when the decision has already been made. Business cards slid across the table toward me, faster than I could refuse them. I accepted a cup of tea and nothing else. Su Shui collected the cards. Then Sun Shenghui dragged his son into the room by the collar, and he kicked him in the back of the knees, and Sun Gan went down onto the boardroom carpet on both knees in front of every shareholder in the company. He kowtowed. He apologized. He admitted publicly that he had sent men to break my legs. His father apologized over him with the heavy despair of a man watching his family's business end in real time. Su Hongyuan told them, quietly, that Sun Gan would not be returning to work. I sipped the tea. I did not look up. The footage reached Yao Qian's phone before she had finished her lunch. Within 48 hours, she had heard the story from every contact she owned, and by the second evening, she and her mother were at the gate of my Qinglong villa in a rented car with gift bags and a rehearsed apology. Shu Li had dressed for the occasion, the expensive kapow, the jade bracelet, the same jade bracelet she had worn the afternoon she called me mud. The security guards stopped them. Shu Li shouted that she was the son-in-law's mother. The guards did not understand. One of them called the villa. I came down to the gate myself. I did not send anyone. I wanted this done in my own voice. Shu Li opened with warmth, as if the last conversation had happened to two other people. She suggested we could set a wedding date. Yao Qian cried. She said Sun Gan meant nothing to her, that she had loved me since freshman year, that I had once saved her in college, and she had never forgotten it. She said she would die without me. She said it the way her mother had taught her to say it. I waited until she was finished. Then I told them, quietly, that the afternoon we had rehearsed once was now played twice. The first time I had begged. The second time I had walked out. There would not be a third performance. I told the security guards, in front of them, that from this moment forward, these two women were not to pass this gate. Shu Li's face went blank. It was the exact small animal blink I had promised myself I would witness. Yao Qian's mouth opened and closed, and no sound came out. I turned and walked back up the drive toward the villa. I did not look back. I did not need to. Above the manor, the late afternoon sky was bleeding orange over the Jiangnan hills, and in the west wing of the villa, a crate of raw jade from Su Hongyuan's personal supply was already waiting where I had asked the housekeeper to leave it. The first stones of the spirit-gathering array I would lay in this floor 1 Earth season from now. In my study sat a small carved object I had been shaping for 2 days. Plumwood, the size of a thumbnail, inscribed with a single character too fine to read without a lens. A gift for Su Shui when she next came to the villa. She would think it was a courtesy. It was not a courtesy. It was an anchor. I would not explain it to her. Someday, far from this afternoon, in a country I had not yet heard of, that anchor would tell me exactly where she was when I needed to know. I stood at the top of the drive a long time. Somewhere below me, Shu Li and Yao Qian were still walking back to their rented car. Somewhere in a Hangzhou office building, Sun Gan was learning how to write his own resignation letter. Somewhere across an ocean of years, a woman's sleeve brushed against my wrist in a memory so clear I could have counted the threads of the silk. The first life was closed. The tea was cold. The door at the top of the mountain was mine. I went back inside. 4 days of seclusion in the Qinglong villa ended with a phone call from Gu Dongqing. I was sitting cross-legged on the raw wood floor of the west wing, jade crate unopened beside me, running a slow cycle of the Taiji 9 revolutions through meridians stitching themselves back together like a cracked porcelain cup. The spirit key on Earth was thin. 4 days, and I had barely budged from early foundation. A long road ahead. Then the phone rang. Gu Dongqing, the only name in my contact list that belonged to the old life and was still worth answering. He asked if I would come to the college reunion that night, in the careful voice he used when he knew the answer was going to cost me something. I said yes before he finished. In my first life, he had been the only classmate who sat with me after Yao Qian left, who paid for my noodles when I was broke, who kept calling after everyone else stopped. I had not protected him then. That was going to be different now. I took a taxi across the river to a mid-tier restaurant near the old campus and stepped into a private room already warm with the cologne and laughter of people who had decided, before I arrived, that I was still the poor man they remembered. Gu Dongqing lit up when he saw me. The rest of the room cooled in the opposite direction. A classmate named Yang Kunliang was holding court at the head of the long table. Tailored suit, silver watch, turned inward the way men wear it when they want you to ask. The self-appointed success story of our year, he announced, loud enough for the walls, that he knew Black Tiger, the man who ran Western Hangzhou's underworld, and the meal tonight was on him. Then he looked at me. He worked through the practiced set, still unemployed, still dumped, still mud. A toad, he said, that had tried to eat swan meat and been spit out. The room laughed on cue. Shimo, his permanent shadow, asked me loudly why I had not greeted Yao Qian across the table. Yao Qian was sitting 6 seats down, looking at her plate as if it were reading her sentence. She had heard by now about Sun Gan and the villa and the gate. She understood which afternoon we were replaying, and that nobody at this table did. I sat beside Gu Dongqing and said nothing. I cataloged faces, not for revenge, for memory. The few who had nodded when I came in, the many who had turned their shoulders, the one who had saved me a seat. Yang Kunliang did not like being unanswered. He pulled out his phone and announced, in the tone men use when they want the room to remember later who made the call, that he was going to put in a word with Black Tiger, just in case things got out of hand tonight. He wanted me to see him make it. 20 minutes later, the private room door banged open and half a dozen thugs walked in behind a heavyset man with a shaved head and a jade tiger at his throat. Black Tiger himself. He looked at the room like a landlord looking at late tenants. Yang Kunliang stood up with a smile that did not reach his mouth and pointed at me. Black Tiger crossed the room in 3 steps. Gu Dongqing had stood up by instinct when the door opened, trying in that old good-hearted way of his to put himself between the trouble and me. Black Tiger swung an open palm at his face. The palm did not land. I had caught his wrist in the air. I had not decided to do it. My body had. Something in me that had spent the last hour listening to this table laugh at a man who had fed me in college simply did not allow his face to be hit. I released the wrist slowly so the whole room could see Black Tiger's hand hanging useless. Then I slapped him once, twice. The second one I sent with fingertips folded and a thread of chi through the knuckle, and his ribs cracked with a sound the room felt through the floor. He went into the wall. A front tooth bounced on the tiles. His 2 henchmen rushed me and went down without getting closer than an arm's length. The private room went quiet, the way a field goes quiet before a storm. Yang Kunliang's mouth hung open. Yao Chen was staring at me with an expression I had never seen her wear in either life. Something between terror and grief. The understanding of a debt she could no longer pay. Black Tiger dragged himself up against the wall, spat blood, and told me through the blood that I had made a mistake I could not afford. His boss, he said, was a man nobody in Hangzhou wanted to cross. He fumbled his phone out and dialed on speaker so the room would hear him save face. I let him. I wanted to know who had been collecting rent off him anyway. The voice that answered knew my name. Black Tiger had gotten through maybe 1 sentence. Boss, there is a problem. A kid at the reunion. When the voice on the other end stopped him, the voice asked, very carefully, whether the kid's name was Lin Luo. Black Tiger, confused, said yes. The voice said it would be there in 10 minutes. It said Black Tiger should not move. It said it twice. 10 minutes later, a line of black cars folded into the parking lot, and 100 men in matching dark jackets filed into the corridor outside the private room. At their head was a lean man in his mid-30s with a scar running through his left eyebrow and the short spring step of someone whose feet had decided how to fight before his head did. Su Shan, Su Shui's cousin, the man Black Tiger answered to. He took in the broken wall, the tooth on the floor, the ribs, and me. Then he turned on his own man. The slap he gave Black Tiger rang louder than Black Tiger's ribs had. He kicked his legs out, shouted him down. I heard the words Mr. Lin 3 times in the shouting, and made Black Tiger crawl on his knees across the ruined carpet to me and press his forehead to the floor. Black Tiger kowtowed. He apologized through a bloody mouth. He begged. Su Shan turned and bowed to me, a precise 90-degree bow, introduced himself as Su Shui's cousin, and offered to cripple the man at my feet if 1 word from me would settle it. He offered it the way a vassal offers a sword, hilt first. I waited. The room waited with me. Then, I told him that since he belonged to the Su family, we would leave it at that. He almost wept with relief. He invited me to tea with Su Hongyuan. I said I would come when I had time. He pressed a business card into my hand with both of his, paid the reunion's entire bill in a thick roll of red notes, and led his 100 men back out. The classmates who had mocked me an hour earlier were on their feet, suddenly remembering my name. They wanted my WeChat. They wanted to know how I knew Su Hongyuan. Chow Yufan slid into Yao Chen's seat and asked me, in a sweet voice, if I was free for drinks later. I watched her face and understood, cleanly, that nothing in this room was worth another minute of my breath. Gu Dongqing stood up. He looked around the table and told them, plainly, that they were hypocrites, and he was ashamed of having eaten with them. Then he looked at me. I stood. We walked out together. We had dinner the next evening at a quieter place by the canal. He did not ask me how I had cracked a man's ribs with a slap. He did not ask about Su Shan. He poured the beiju and told me, eyes wet, that in the old days, he had always been quietly afraid I would give up on myself, and now he could see I had not. I clinked my glass against his. I told him the dark things in my life were not his to carry, and that as long as he kept calling, I would keep answering. I meant it on a scale he could not hear. While we were eating, Su Shui walked into the restaurant. Her composure was held together with visible seams. She said quietly that her grandfather had been taken. A group calling itself the Yan family, a clan Su Hongyuan had driven out of Hangzhou a decade ago, had snatched him. They had set a martial arena challenge. Hand over every asset on the Su ledger by sunset, or the old man dies. 2 martial artists the family had sent already lay crippled. Her father's uncle Su Chengyi had hired a third, a local champion named Niu Qiang, and refused to let her even mention my name. A doctor, he said, was beneath this kind of fight. She had come anyway. She had come to beg. I told her to finish her tea. I told Gu Dongqing I would call. Then I went with her. The Su estate was already full when we arrived. Su Chengyi was in a dark suit, holding court around Niu Qiang, a wide-shouldered bull working the relatives like a pulpit. When Su Chengyi saw me beside Su Hua, he barked at his niece for bringing an outsider to a crisis. He said the words, "just a doctor," in a tone I remembered from Shu Li's mouth in another life. Niu Qiang looked me up and down like a butcher pricing a small bird and warned me not to wander onto the arena and get killed by mistake. I almost turned around. Then, Su Hua's fingers closed on my sleeve. Su Shan across the courtyard gave me a look of pure apology, and I remembered the favor I owed this family. I stayed. The arena was an old dirt floor ring at the edge of the city. Bigwigs from the surrounding industries had come to watch the Su family bleed. Niu Qiang walked to the ropes loud with his fist of the startling bull and his gale of the bull leg. His opponent waited in the middle of the ring, a thin man with a long jaw and a stance I recognized from the old demon organization manuals. Peak of external strength, Yan Lifu. I sat down and closed my eyes. 3 steps in, I knew how the round would end. Yan Lifu stomped the ring once, and the ring shivered. He moved. Niu Qiang moved to block. The hit folded Niu Qiang in half, sent him into the ropes, and left him with the bones of his left side making a shape they were not supposed to make. Yan Lifu laughed. He gave the Su family 60 seconds to sign every paper the Yan lawyers were holding out. He said the old man would be returned as a corpse otherwise. Su Chengyi went down on both knees in the dirt and wept. Su Shua's hand tightened on my sleeve until her knuckles went white. She did not speak. She did not have to. Every breath she took in the ring's direction was a question she could not ask out loud. I stood up. The crowd laughed when they saw me climb the ropes. A sick boy in a gray shirt stepping into Yan Lifu's ring. Yan Lifu grinned. He told me to go home and drink my milk, said the Su family had run out of men and started sending delicate things, and rolled his shoulder into a 100-pound hammer of a punch. I raised one finger. The finger met his sternum at the exact center of the bone. Less effort than opening a jar. A dry crack the entire ring heard. Yan Lifu stopped mid-step. He looked down at his own chest as if it belonged to someone he had just met. Then he folded backward onto the dirt. He coughed twice and understood in the last clean second of his life that he had been a hired knife in a room that quietly contained a sword. He slammed his own skull on the packing of the ring. Before I could take a second step, I let him. I already had what I needed. A slip of location had run off his surface, thought the instant my kui touched his chest. A storage factory on the west edge of the city. 2 more demon organization operators holding Su Hongyuan in the back room. I did not look at Su Chengyi. I told Su Shui and Su Shan to come with me. Su Chengyi, on his knees, began to beg. I walked past him. He followed. The factory was as Yan Lifu had left it in his thoughts. Broken skylights, dust an inch thick on the rusted floor. Su Hongyuan was on a folding cot at the back of the main hall, lips gone blue, the edge of a goo parasite visible in the black thread of qi at his throat. I slipped a pill past his teeth. His breath steadied inside a minute. The 2 operators came out of the shadows the way operators do. One from the beam above us, one from a side door at speed. Ghost Shadow, the fast one, went for Su Shui's neck. She stepped, on an instinct she would not be able to explain later, between me and him. I moved her behind me. I closed the distance on the first operator, open palm, through the sternum. He folded. Ghost Shadow was already at the window. He got one word out, expert, and I was there before the word finished. For a single breath, I remembered another woman who had once stepped in front of a blow meant for me, and I had to push the memory down in order to walk. 2 corpses behind us. Dead witnesses leave no trail back to Donghai. I kept walking. Su Hongyuan sat up on the cot, saw his granddaughter alive, and reached for my sleeve the way drowning men reach for rope. 2 days later, at the Qinglong Villa, he tried, for the 3rd time, to sign the entire Su family into my hands. Chairmanship, family seal, head of the house. Every relative he had was in the room watching him offer it. Su Chengyi at the back looked like a man watching his own funeral be rescheduled. I told the old man, quietly, that I did not like kneeling, and I was not going to stand at the head of anyone's table. I told him what I wanted instead, more of the herbs from the first list, a steady supply, no questions asked. And then, because the floor was already warm, I told him the idea I had been carrying privately since the rental apartment, a pharmaceutical brand, his capital, his distribution, my pills, Qinglong as the name. The majority share mine. He agreed before I had finished. Su Chengyi agreed immediately after, because the room had stopped taking his opinions. Inside a week, the news had moved through every tier of the Hangzhou Delta. The man with one finger, the man the demon organization had lost 2 operators to. Wealthy envoys began arriving at the Qinglong gate with gift crates and letters of introduction. I told the housekeeper to turn every one of them away. Rarity was a multiplier. On my way back into the villa that last evening, I stopped Sushan at his car and put a small jade pendant on a red cord into his palm, thumb-sized, a thin spiral cut into one face. I told him to wear it under his shirt and not take it off. He asked, half smiling, what it was for. I told him to just wear it and not to ask. He closed his hand around it and bowed. He did not ask twice. I walked up the drive, closed the door of the west wing behind me, and sat back down on the raw wood floor where the jade crate was still waiting. 4 days of cultivation, 1 reunion, 1 arena, 1 rescue, 1 partnership signed. Below the manor, the whole city had started learning a name it would not stop learning for years. I let the air out of my lungs and drew the first clean cycle of the new seclusion through my meridians. Above the courtyard, the late spring sky had gone dark, a single thin star open over the east ridge, and for one breath, I could almost hear a sleeve brushing my wrist across an ocean of years. I had work to do. I took a bus to Fu County 3 mornings after the last envoy was turned away at the villa gate. I could have had Su Shan drive me. In my first life, I had sent exactly that, a hired car and a cashier's check, while I drank myself out of shape in a Hangzhou rental, and my parents had opened the envelope and never asked why the boy would not come home. This time, I took the bus. There are things a son should arrive at on mortal time. The compound was exactly as I remembered it. Concrete stairwell, blue plastic mailboxes, the plum tree by the gate my father had planted the year I passed the university exam. My mother opened the door with a bag of groceries in one arm and a spring onion in the other, and when she saw my face, she dropped the onion on the doormat. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she said my name. Then she said it again. Then, softer, why didn't you tell me? Her eyes filled the way eyes do when a person has been braced for the worst news for a long time and the news does not come. I took the groceries. I walked in ahead of her so she could wipe her face before I turned around. Feng Sui had aged 5 years in the 3 I had not been back. She looked at me the way a woman looks at a son she had quietly given up on without telling herself she had. I told her about Yao Qian. I told her about the job at Su Group. She did not believe the second one. She made me tell her twice, then stood up and wiped her hands on her apron and started to laugh, then cried while she laughed, and she said the word good 3 times the way old country women do when they run out of other words. She called my father at the factory. Our son is back. Come home early. He came home on his old motorcycle half an hour later, grease still on his fingers. Lin looping, 50 years old that day, square face, thick brows, a plain dark blue work jacket. He stood in the doorway and looked me up and down once and snorted softly, and he said, "Ah, son, don't make your mother fuss. Come eat." That was all. In Fu County, that was a confession of love. We ate. Mother cooked 6 dishes for a man with nothing to prove. Father poured baijiu into a little porcelain cup and did not ask about my job or my ex-girlfriend or the last 3 years. He asked if I remembered the plum tree by the gate. I said I did. He said it had not bloomed this year. He said it the way men of his generation say I missed you. I slept in my childhood bed that night. Under every quiet breath in that small apartment was the memory of a different ending, a telegram, a funeral nobody came to, a pair of old people who had died, believing their son had failed them. I lay still and promised them, quietly, that this life would be different. The next morning, my father rode the motorcycle to the corner market for the birthday noodles. My mother and I were slicing ginger when her phone rang. A neighbor, voice tight, accident at the gate. My mother could not keep up with me on the stairs. My father was on the asphalt beside a black Bentley, his motorcycle folded under the front bumper. He was sitting up, hand pressed to a scraped elbow, already arguing, already insisting he had the right of way. A young man in a silk shirt stood over him, with a mistress in one arm and a phone in the other. Shiba, only son of Shi Dongfeng, the petty king of Fu County. He was telling my father, in the loud, slurred voice wealthy small-town boys use with strangers, that my father owed him 500,000 yuan for the paint on the car door, and that my father would kneel for it. The traffic cop was already there. Song J. Narrow uniform, thin mustache. He had written his report before he had looked at the scene. Full responsibility, my father dismissed the appeal. The crowd at the gate was 40 people deep, and no one spoke. Shiba raised his hand. I arrived one step behind my mother. The crowd closed their eyes, the way people in small towns close their eyes when a man like Shiba raises his hand, because the result was always the same. I told him, quietly, that if he touched my father, I would make him regret ever being born. He laughed. He finished the motion anyway. His palm landed on my father's cheek. The crack in my composure happened then. Not loud, not theatrical, just a very small hinge at the back of my skull that had been holding for a very long time and finally let go. In a cultivator's life, you learn over centuries not to care about the insults of mortals, their threats, their brief, violent hands. You do not learn it about your father. I had not learned it in 900 years. I did not learn it in that second either. I stepped across the asphalt. Shiba turned toward me with his hand still warm. I slapped him once, open-palmed, the way he had slapped my father, and I put exactly enough of my strength into the blow to break the small bones along his cheek without taking the eye, to fold his nose without killing him, to disfigure him for life without dropping him where his mother would never see him upright again. He left the ground. He hit the utility pole behind the Bentley. The pole rang. His mistress screamed. He slid down with his face already the wrong shape, and a tooth bounced on the asphalt. I walked past Songji to the Bentley. I opened the dashcam housing and reached for the memory card. The card left its slot before my fingers got there. A breath of ki the size of a closing fist, calling it into my hand the way you call a bird to your wrist. The crowd saw me reach. They did not see the half second the card was in the air. To them, it was sleight of hand. I slipped it into my pocket. I looked at Songjae. I told him, without raising my voice, that he no longer needed to wear the uniform and that he should disappear from my sight before I remembered I had seen him. He went. He did not look back. I turned to what was left of Shiba and told him, and the 40 people at the gate, that the Shi family would be out of Fu County by nightfall. Then, I picked my father up off the asphalt and walked my parents home. My mother held my arm the whole way and did not speak. My father kept trying to look at my face and kept looking down. At the door, my mother asked me, in the small voice she used when I was 8, whether I should leave for Hangzhou that evening. I told her, gently, that the Su family owed me a favor and I had already called it in. Neither of them believed me. They thought I was comforting them. Shi Dongfeng did not accept the afternoon quietly. By 4, 2 policemen in a county cruiser were at our door with handcuffs and a fabricated file. Assault, robbery. The dashcam, they said, was an article worth tens of thousands, and I had removed it from a private vehicle. My father went down onto his knees in the doorway before I could stop him. My mother made a sound I had never heard a human being make. I lifted my father up, told my parents I would be home by supper, and walked out with the cuffs on in front of the neighbors. I did not resist. A cultivator breaking out of a holding cell leaves a record on 5 different desks by Monday morning, watched by agencies whose attention I could not afford yet. One phone call was cleaner than a broken wall. From the cell, I called Su Hongyuan. I gave him the names: Shi Dongfeng, Fu County, a fabricated assault. Su Group's pharmaceutical distribution had held the Fu County wholesale contract for a decade. The county hierarchy owed Su Hongyuan favors, marinating since before Shi Dongfeng bought his first villa. Su Hongyuan did not ask me to repeat anything. He told me to drink the tea they would bring me. He hung up. While I sat in the cell, the relatives came. Uncles, aunts, a cousin of my father's named Lin Chengming, my mother's younger sister. They came with faces full of worry and mouths full of small sums owed. Tens of thousands here, 40,000 there, little loans from the years my parents had been scraping to send me to Hangzhou. They sat on my mother's couch while she was still shaking from the arrest and told her, one by one, in voices soft with practiced sympathy, that they were sorry about the son. And, by the way, cash flow problems, a car, a surgery, a school fee. Could she perhaps return the small loan soon? They had calculated that an arrest meant the family was finished. They meant to extract before the house was seized. Every one of them took my mother's hand before they named the number. My mother did not have the words for it. My father did. He put the phone down after the 4th call and sat with his hands on his knees. And the man who had been shouting at Song Ji that morning became a very old man who had just understood which way the wind had been blowing in his own family all these years. The station chief walked into my cell a little past 7, sweating. He said, "Mr. Lin," in a voice he had not yet rehearsed. He said the whole thing had been a misunderstanding. Behind him, in a hurried suit, came the head of Fu County himself, Zhang Guangde, apologizing across the interrogation table like a man who had just heard which way his career had started to tip. "Provincial call," he said. "Provincial call." He drove me home personally and apologized 3 times on the drive. I walked into my parents' apartment at dusk, and the room, which had been full of relatives pressing my mother for money an hour earlier, went dead silent. Lin Chengming stood up first, in a face struggling to remember its own lines, and asked how I had gotten out. I told him it was all the other party's fault, and it had nothing to do with me, and I sat down on the couch beside my mother without looking at any of the others. Then I took my father's debt notebook from the shelf. I read the names aloud. I read the numbers aloud. I opened a banking app and transferred every single one of those numbers in full to every single one of those names in the room, in front of every cousin and aunt and uncle who had come to pick bones from my mother's lap that afternoon. Their phones all chimed at once. They looked at their screens. They looked at my mother. My mother did not look at them. I told them, quietly, that the loans were settled and that from this hour forward, none of them were to cross the threshold of this house again. Not for a birthday, not for a funeral, not ever. Then, I told them to leave. They stood up. They tried to find words. They did not find any. They started toward the door. Shi Dongfeng and Shiba were already at the door. The father had come in person. Shiba's face was wrapped in gauze. One eye would never sit right again. Shi Dongfeng, the petty king of Fu County, the man whose name made traffic police lie, bowed at the waist on my parents' cracked linoleum and began apologizing before he had fully crossed the threshold. He named the accident. He named the fabricated charges. He dragged his son by the collar down beside him and forced Shiba onto both knees on my mother's floor. I did not answer him. I let him kneel. The relatives, halfway to the door, stopped. They saw a Shi on his knees in a Lin living room. They did not understand yet. A black car pulled up outside. Su Wei stepped out in a charcoal skirt suit with the Su Group corporate crest on a small pin at her lapel. I had phoned her from the holding cell through Su Hongyuan with a schedule. She had driven through the night. She walked in, apologized to me for being late, greeted my parents with the bow a daughter-in-law would give, and turned to the room. She introduced herself as the general manager of Su Group. She introduced me as the honorary chairman and benefactor of the Su family. She said, in the polite flat tone she used for the weather, that with one word from Mr. Lin, the Su family would make sure the Shi family could not do business in Fu County, in Hangzhou, or in any market the Su Group's contracts touched. Shi Dongfeng's face went the color of old paper. He slapped his son hard enough to rock him. He shouted at him to kneel properly. Shiba put his forehead on the linoleum and wept and begged. I watched a full minute of it. Then I looked at the father. "Aren't you going to kneel?" I said. It was the first sentence I had spoken to him. Shi Dongfeng went down on both knees beside his son and pressed his forehead to my mother's floor. I told them, without raising my voice, that every Shi family business in Fu County would close this week, that Songzhou was already finished, and that the legal consequences of their decade of extortion would arrive on a provincial schedule I had no further interest in discussing. Then I told them to get out. Shi Dongfeng pulled his son up by the collar, and they went. The relatives were still by the door. They had seen. They did not speak. One of them tried to smile at me. I did not look at him. They left. My mother went into the kitchen, stood at the sink with her hands on the edge of it, shoulders moving once, and then she started washing dishes. Su Shui, without a word, tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, stood beside her, and dried every plate my mother washed. The corporate heiress of the Yangtze River Delta was drying plates in my mother's kitchen. My father set down a fresh cup of baijiu untouched and looked at me for a long time, and I understood, from the look, that he had believed every word I had said all day and had decided not to ask. Song Jay's firing came by phone at dusk. By morning, the gossip had crossed every neighborhood in Fu County. Everyone in the compound knew the Shi father and son had kneeled in a Lin living room. I drove my parents to Qinglong Manor myself. I packed their clothes. I carried their suitcases down the stairwell one at a time. My mother cried again at the door of the apartment, quietly this time, and my father locked the door and handed me the key without a word. Su Hongyuan was waiting at the villa gate. He opened the car door for me. He bowed to my father at the waist, called him Brother Lin on first meeting, walked my mother into the foyer with his own arm, and made tea as if he had been a house guest there for 30 years. My father and Su Hongyuan were calling each other brother inside an hour. My mother wiped her eyes a second time, less bitterly, watching them. Su Hui stood beside me in the corridor and told me, softly, almost shyly, that her grandfather's birthday banquet was the following week and that she would like me to come. I told her I would. Above the manor, the late afternoon sky had gone pale gold over the Jiangnan hills. My parents' voices came through the open sitting room door with the unfamiliar register mother of people who had just started, at 50 years old, to be safe. Somewhere across an ocean of years, a woman's sleeve brushed against my wrist in a memory so clear I could have counted the threads of the silk, and for one breath, I thought she would have liked my mother. The crack in my composure had closed. I went to find the jade crate. The week after my parents moved into the villa, I spent walking the mountain. I walked it at dawn when the mist was still heavy in the pines, and again in the late afternoon when the sun crossed the ridgeline at the angle that made the spirit veins visible to a man who had spent 900 years learning how to look at hills. Qinglong Manor sat on a convergence of 5 veins, which was why the Jiangnan families had fought over the ground for a century without understanding why they wanted it. I counted the acupoints along the slope. I marked 4 compass positions at the villa's boundary with small cairns of loose stone. I drew the geometry in my head, the way Lin Changqing had drawn it 10,000 times. It was not theory any longer, it was muscle memory. I called Su Hongyuan the morning of the 3rd day. I told him I needed top quality raw jade, not cut, not polished, stones straight from the mine. And I needed it in quantity, and I needed it by the end of the week. I told him to bill it against Su Group's books as decoration for the villa. He did not ask why. He had learned already not to ask why. The trucks arrived the next evening. Su Hongyuan came with them, and Su Hui, and Su Chengye, looking like a man who had spent 2 nights awake, chasing jade across 3 provinces. They unloaded the crates in the courtyard and waited to see my face. I let the lid off one, ran a fingertip across the unpolished surface of the largest stone, and told the old man the quality was clean. He exhaled visibly. Su Shui smiled without looking at me. I laid the anchor stones myself. 4 compass positions, the largest at the north ridge, the others falling into place in a geometry Su Chengye would later describe to his accountant as very elaborate landscaping. I spent 2 nights at it, alone, the villa asleep behind me. When I set the final stone and released the binding breath that closed the array, the spiritual key inside Qinglong Manor rose, quietly and without theater, to roughly 3 times the density of West Lake. My mother said the air smelled clean in the morning. My father said his chest felt lighter. They did not know what they were breathing. They were not ready to know yet. In my own room, sitting cross-legged on the raw wood floor where the jade crate had once been, I felt chi refinement thread stabilize for the first time. A thin, single line of pure energy, anchoring a floor I had been trying to stand on for 6 months. The ceiling above it, Tongsuan, was still far, but now the floor held. Now the engine had fuel. That same afternoon, Hongxing stood on the mountain road below the villa and cursed my name to his friends. I did not hear it myself. Sushan told me later. A black Ferrari and a Porsche had come up the approach road the morning of Su Hongyuan's birthday banquet. 3 young men and their drivers, with Hongxing at the wheel, calling himself the Prince of the Mountain Roads, and telling his friends that the new honorary chairman of Su Group was a nobody, a mongrel his father's scouts had missed, and that by tonight he would have Su Shui on his arm, and the whole banquet laughing at the mongrel's expense. They ran a race up the switchbacks for 1,000,000 yuan ahead. Hongxing nearly clipped a man walking up the road. He leaned out his window and cursed the man and drove on. He did not recognize the man. The man was me. I kept walking. The mountain was mine. I would deal with the Ferrari inside the banquet. Su Hongyuan had held the banquet in the manor's main hall. 200 guests, the Delta's second-rank families in their silks and their jade, paper lanterns in the courtyard, a long table of the Jiangnan dishes the old man preferred. My parents were there in clean new clothes, with Su Hongyuan and Su Shui flanking them the way family flanks family. I stood back. I was not here to be seen until Su Shui chose to show me. Hongxing was holding court at a side table, loud with his cars and his races and the black gold group his father ran. He saw me come in and his face tightened, the way a face tightens when an expensive mistake walks into the room. He crossed the hall. He worked through his practiced insults, the ones about my clothes, my face, the kind of man who gets invited to a banquet by Su Shui, and he finished by announcing, loud enough for the hall to carry it, that he would not eat at the same table as a toad, and that the Su family's bodyguards should throw me out. The bodyguards did not move. The bodyguards knew who I was. I let the hall hold its breath. Then I asked him, quietly, whether he had fallen into a latrine that afternoon, because his mouth was full of filth. The hall held its breath harder. Somewhere at the back of the room, my mother made a small, startled sound, and Su Hongyuan put a hand on her wrist. Hongxing's face went the color of his silk shirt. He lunged across the space between us, hand open, already swinging for my cheek. He had been slapping people his whole life for less. He did not know he had walked out of that life 3 seconds earlier. I stepped aside. I was not fast in any way the hall could name. A chi refinement reflex reads to mortals as athletic skill, nothing more, and his palm went through the air where my face had been. Then I returned the gesture. door, once, open-handed, just enough key through the knuckle to crack along the ribs and fold his nose sideways without killing him, calibrated for a room that contained my mother. He went into the wall. His ribs cracked with a sound the hall felt through the floor. He slid down with blood already at his lip and one eye unfocused, and the silver watch on his wrist scraped from the impact. The bodyguards moved toward him only because Su Hui nodded once. She stood up then. Su Hui at the head of the hall, in a charcoal dress with the Su Group crest at her collar. She stepped forward and she told the 200 guests, in the polite register she used when the weather was being stated, that Mr. Lin was her honored guest, that he was the man who had cured her grandfather, and that he held the honorary chairmanship of Su Group. She named my standing in front of every second-rank family in the Delta. She said it where Hongxing could hear it through his broken ribs as his own bodyguards carried him out. She did not look at him once. The banquet never fully recovered. It thinned and rearranged itself into quieter clusters of people, deciding, in low voices, what they had just watched. My mother reached for my hand once during the meal and did not let go until dessert. The demand arrived the next morning by phone. Hong Tiequan himself, from the hospital bedside where his son was still too dosed to speak clearly, told Su Shan that the Su family would deliver 100 million yuan in compensation by nightfall, that I would come to the Hong villa personally to kneel and apologize, and that if either condition was missed, he would kill me, my parents, and everyone in the villa down to the kitchen staff. Su Shan ran red lights getting to Qinglong. Su Hongyuan listened to the threat without changing his face. He told me the old man's terms and waited for my answer, the way a boat waits for the tide. I told him I would go apologize. Su Hui stood up fast from her chair. Su Hongyuan did not. Su Shan stared. I said it again, quieter, so that Su Shan would hear the whole shape of it. Tonight. I would go tonight. I would go alone with Su Shan driving. And I asked Su Shan, very gently, whether he had ever considered replacing Hong Taekwon at the head of the Hangzhou underworld. He went still. I watched him arrive at the answer I had already written for him. Then, I told Su Hongyuan to move my parents to a guarded secondary property for the evening. He understood without asking. Inside 20 minutes, my mother and father were in a car with 4 of his own men, bound for a compound outside the city I had never seen. Su Shan drove me to the Hong villa at dusk. The villa sat in a walled compound on the western outskirts, a kilometer of perimeter, 24 private soldiers in matching dark suits along the drive with holstered handguns and earpieces. A courtyard paved in pale stone. At the center of the courtyard, chained to an iron ring sunk into the ground, was the ancient ape, a thick-shouldered beast Hong Tiquan had bought from an underground fighting ring and kept as a status display. It could tear a wolf apart with its hands. It had been paraded in front of every rival boss in Hangzhou for 3 years as the argument that ended every negotiation. Hong Tiequan waited on the villa steps in a tailored black suit with a cigar in one hand and his son's bandaged face in his head, and Hongxing standing beside him in a wheelchair with a tube in his nose. I walked through the gate. Su Shan stayed at the car. Hong Tiequan performed the reception the way he had performed every reception of his 20-year reign. He called me forward. He told me to kneel. He told me he had decided to take only the 100 million out of magnanimity. He told me to kowtow 3 times, and he would let me live long enough to walk home. I told him he could not afford the price of my apology. He laughed. He clicked his fingers. Somebody at the edge of the courtyard unsnapped the chain on the ape, and the beast came across the stone at me at a full run, arms wide, mouth open, the way a trained killing animal comes at a small man it has been pointed at. I lifted one finger. The strike met the ape at the crown of the skull as it rose. Less effort than closing a door. A breath of chi refinement key through the fingertip, shaped to a single point. The creature dropped. 1 sentence of motion, and then a heavy body on pale stone. I did not look at it a second time. The soldiers opened fire. 24 handguns at once. Bullets crossed the courtyard from every compass point. I drew a breath into the space between my palms and shaped it. A curved pressure field, 3 meters radius, holding the air like a blown glass envelope. And the rounds entered the envelope and bent. Every soldier in that courtyard took his own round through his own chest inside the same second. They went down where they stood. The courtyard became quiet in the way courtyards become quiet when every breathing thing in it stops at once. Hong Taekwon finally understood what had walked into his gate. He raised his own gun. He fired twice. I was already across the courtyard. The bullets found the wall behind where I had been. I closed the last 3 steps and met his chest with a single finger at the heart, just once, and he folded forward onto the pale stone and did not get up. I left Hongxing alive. He was in the wheelchair, screaming. He had not moved through any of it. He was still screaming when I walked past him. I could have ended the screaming. I did not. The boy who had lunged across my banquet was not what I killed men for. The boy watching his father die with his own gun in his hand, surrounded by his father's corpses, was a better ending than a clean death would have been. I left him breathing. I would hear later that he had not stopped screaming by morning. Inside 1 minute, the Hong Villa was a body count and one surviving heir. I walked back to the car. Su Shan was on the ground beside the passenger door, not breathing loudly. He was looking at me the way a man looks at a thing he has just finally understood. He got into the driver's seat without speaking. On the drive back into Hangzhou, I gave him 2 lines of permission. Take the Hong territory. Take it clean. Everything through legal channels from this point forward. He nodded once for each line. He did not ask whether I was serious. He had stopped asking me that kind of question in the courtyard. Before we left the villa compound, I walked through every room once and pulled the memory from the surveillance drives with a breath. The same gesture I had used for the Bentley's dash cam, scaled up, every server in the building wiped in one pass. By the time the police arrived 40 minutes later on Su Shan's call, the villa would read as self-defense by 1 man against 24 armed attackers, and the only witness able to testify otherwise would be the boy in the wheelchair, still screaming. I will tell the rest in the shape the city learned it. By morning, Hongxing was in a psychiatric facility. The doctors would use the word incurable before the end of the first day. The Hangzhou police investigation closed as self-defense inside a week under quiet pressure from Su Hongyuan's political network. The mid-tier operators of the Hong organization read the same body count the police read, and by Monday afternoon, they had quietly transferred their loyalty to Su Shan because a winner pays and a corpse does not. Su Shan absorbed Hong Tiequan's territory, his assets, his contracts, his men, inside 24 hours. He wore the small jade pendant I had given him in Phase 2 under his shirt the whole weekend. By the end of the week, Hangzhou and the Hangzhou Delta had one standing underworld boss, and he answered to me. Later, I learned that while I was at Qinglong that night, in a glass-walled boardroom on the Donghai coast, 7 men were sitting at a round table, watching a grainy photograph of my face pass from hand to hand. The man at the head of the table was Long Yi, 55, thin, the Donghai faction's senior boss, 35 years in power. His strategist Gongsun Yishi had opened the meeting by telling the council that Hong Tiequan had been murdered in his own courtyard by a man from Hangzhou named Lin Changqing, and that the Hangzhou Delta was now under the Su family's flag, which was to say, under the flag of a man the council had never heard of a month earlier. Xie Biao, a burly captain with a scorpion tattoo on his cheek, spoke up about taking Hangzhou for himself. Long Yi did not answer him. Long Yi had already made the decision. He turned to his son, Long Kun, early 20s, with a gold chain and a sneer, and the confidence of an heir who had not yet been punctured. Long Yi told him to go to Hangzhou and bring Lin Changqing's head home. Long Kun promised it would be on the table within the month. The other captains swallowed their objections, the way men swallow objections around a table where objections have consequences. I knew none of this. I was on the balcony of the west wing of my villa that night, above a courtyard full of fresh mountain air 3 times denser with spirit qi than it had been a week earlier, with my parents asleep in the main house and Su Shui's invitation folded in my pocket, and the first clean qi refinement cycle running through meridians that had finally, after 6 months, stopped cracking. Across an ocean of years, a woman's sleeve brushed against my wrist in a memory so clear I could have counted the threads of the silk. In a glass room on the Donghai coast, a grainy photograph was still moving around the table. The photograph I never saw was already in motion while I sat on my balcony. By the time I learned its face, the first hand had already closed on a trigger. Su Shan called me the following week. He had taken a lakeside meeting at West Lake, the kind he kept to on a weekly cadence, because old habits die slowly in men who become bosses overnight. The contact was a mid-tier Delta operator with a name that had been on his books since before Hong Tiequan's courtyard, and the meeting had been booked through a sworn brother of his named Qin Hui. Qin Hui was a man he had taken a knife for once, years earlier, on a warehouse floor neither of them spoke about any longer. That was the kind of history Su Shan walked into West Lake carrying. The rooftop was 200 meters out. The scope was clean. The shot was clean. The trigger finger was Qin Hui's, and the bullet left the barrel at a speed that would have put it through Su Shan's temple and out the far side of his jaw before his body knew it was dying. It stopped 2 centimeters from his skin. He told me later that he heard it more than he saw it, a flat, impossible stillness in the air beside his face, where the shape of the air had gone wrong. A thin ring of pale light flickered at his collar, for less than a second. Then the light was gone and the bullet was on the paving stones at his feet, slightly flattened, like something that had hit a wall he could not see. The jade pendant I had handed him on the night Black Tiger fell was blackened through, cracked across the middle, the inner green gone to the color of ash. It had spent what it carried. It had saved him once and would never do it again. His men were already staged at the lake. They traced the shot line inside the hour. They walked the rooftop stairwell to its end and found Qin Hui 3 blocks east, still moving, not quickly enough. He did not survive the interrogation. Before he stopped speaking, he gave them a name upstream, the son of a Donghai senior boss, a man called Long Kun, with orders and men and a schedule already on Hangzhou soil. Sushan drove to Qinglong at a speed that broke 3 traffic lights and most of the front fender of his car. He came up the mountain path on foot, the way my house rules required, and he knelt in my gravel courtyard with his forehead pressed to the stone. I watched him from the top step. I did not let him kneel long. I told him to get up and tell me. He told me. He showed me the blackened pendant on its red cord. I took it in my palm, closed my fingers around it, and felt the last cold whisper of the qi I had sealed into it a year earlier. It was an old habit from an older life. You do not put a mortal into a leadership chair without pressing a talisman into his hand, because mortals get shot. The insurance had paid out. The insurance was now spent. I told Sushan to put the cord back under his shirt anyway. Men pay attention to men who walk out of bullets, and the rumor of the jade would be worth more than the jade had ever been. Then I moved my parents. My father carried his own suitcase up the back path. He did not ask where we were going. My mother walked behind him with her hand in the small of his back. Su Hongyuan's people were up there already, and the Jin family's records that Su Chengyi had transferred into my keeping the week before, and 2 of Su Shan's most disciplined men. The refuge sat inside a fold of the ridge behind Qinglong Manor, on a natural node of low-grade feng shui that I had mapped in the first weeks after my rebirth. A cultivator searching for human qi signatures would pass over the hollow without registering it. A grandmaster would sense nothing. A bomb would not find them, because a bomb would have no address to aim at. By dusk, my father was standing at the wooden gate of the back mountain compound with a folded newspaper under his arm, and my mother was already learning the names of the Su family children who had been moved in alongside her. Neither of them looked back at me. They had learned across the past year that when I told them to move, they moved. Long Kun's campaign opened the next morning. I will tell it in the shape of a week. A warehouse at the edge of one of the Qinglong pharmaceutical storage parks went up in a kerosene fire at 4 in the morning. Nobody inside. Sushan had already shifted the stocked inventory on my word the day I moved my parents. The fire took a shell and 3 ruined forklifts and a row of scorched brickwork. A car bomb under the left front wheel of Sushan's sedan was found by his driver at 6:30 the same day. The driver had learned to run his hand along every fender before turning a key. The device was crude enough that I suspected Long Kun had wanted it found. A message, not a kill. Sushan had the device dismantled without detonating it and sent the pieces back to the hotel suite in Hangzhou, where Long Kun was living under a false name, along with a note that said nothing at all. A second sniper on a morning of heavy river fog took a shot at a Su Group executive walking across a hotel lobby whose silhouette read, from 40 stories up, as mine. The round hit a marble column. The executive, who had never been shot at before in his life, spent the afternoon in a hospital that did not know how to process him and the evening drinking heavily. The shooter was a free agent contractor, not one of Long Kun's inner men. We never found him. He is probably still alive. Long Kun was widening his net that week, and the net was catching on walls. On the 4th night of the campaign, I drove to a rice paddy outside Hangzhou. At the hour the moon was thin enough to be useless. I had tracked him across 2 days. His strikes had leaked enough of their surveillance texture into the air that a qi refinement sense, now clean and stabilized inside the Qinglong array, could read the shape of where he was sleeping. The paddy was behind a roadside inn he had booked under a name I already knew. He was coming back from a meeting that had not gone well. He was alone on the path. He had 10 meters of wet mud between him and the inn door when I stepped out of the tree line. He reached for the inside of his jacket. He had time for the gesture and not for anything else. A single finger to the temple. The boy who had ordered 3 strikes on my people in 4 days dropped into the rice paddy without a sound. I stood over him for 1 breath. I had killed men I cared about more than I cared about this one. I walked back through the tree line the way I had come and left Sushan's men to remove the body. I did not hide the kill. I wanted Long Yi to see it. I wanted the Donghai table to see it. The message I was sending upstream was simple. The next attempt would require a transformation realm operator, a father who could not protect his only son from a single finger in a rice paddy was not going to replace him with another son. He was going to escalate. While the campaign was burning itself out on my perimeter, a mountain range 500 kilometers south of Hangzhou opened a seam in its own stone. The martial world grapevine carried the news inside 48 hours. A secret realm, the kind that cycled on lunar and stellar alignments, the mortal sex had only half charted, had let its outer shell crack open on its own schedule. The rift would stay open for a month, maybe two. It would periodically release medicinal herbs and low-grade spirit artifacts, the way a wound weeps. Every mid-tier sect within 3 provinces was assembling teams at the base of the range. It was not the richest realm I had ever seen. In my first life, Lin Changqing would have walked past a rift like this without breaking stride. Here, now it was treasure. I did not go in. I sent the Jin family. Jinjiang, the patriarch of a declining martial family out of Linhai, whose daughter I already knew would matter to me in the years ahead, received a short message from Qinglong Pharmaceutical, inviting his house to enter the rift under the company's umbrella, with half the herbal yield going to our contract pharmacies and the other half remaining with the Jin. The Jin family had internal cultivators at the lowest rung. They could actually walk through the rift's outer membrane, which Su Shan's crew could not. The invitation gave them resources they had not seen in a generation and gave me a loyal disciple pipeline building in the backdrop, while I remained visible in Hangzhou as a decoy for the Donghai operators. It was the kind of arrangement that only looked like generosity. Jinjiang came up the mountain in person to accept. I did not meet him that day. I had already entered seclusion. 3 days inside the stabilized Qinglong array, with the siege's casualty risk pressed to 0 by the refuge and the perimeter, and a cultivation acceleration window more valuable than the marginal security of being awake. I sat on the raw wood floor of my room. I pushed through the ceiling that had held me for 6 months. Mid-chi refinement stabilized like a second thread laid beside the first. The silver blood lotus I had taken from the Hangzhou auction house earlier that week burned away into my meridians as it went. And in the depth of the seclusion, in the silence between breaths, I rebuilt from memory a weapon I had not held in 1,000 years. A blood-red sword, thin as a rumor, its edge the color of old killing. I did not forge the weapon itself yet. I forged the shape of it in my mind, the way a man sharpens a name before he writes it. The sword would come when the sword was needed. The memory construct would wait in my meridians until I had the body to hold it. When I came out of seclusion on the 3rd morning, Long Kun's campaign had ended because its author had ended. The Delta's mid-tier underworld had already begun to transfer its loose loyalty towards Su Shan by default. Jinjiang's team was inside the rift. My mother was teaching a 6-year-old Su cousin to fold dumplings in the back mountain kitchen. The outer ring of the siege was broken. I had expected the inner detonation to take longer than it did. Long Yi, I would learn later, boarded a private flight that night out of a Donghai regional airport that did not ask his name at the gate. He flew south over 3 time zones and out of China and into the highlands of northern Thailand. He came down at a private strip outside Chiang Rai with a bodyguard at each shoulder and a small leather case against his chest. He traveled 3 perimeters deep into a jungle compound that the local authorities did not acknowledge on any map. And at the last perimeter, he walked the last half kilometer alone on foot because the man at the end of the path required feet on the ground. He had not seen his master in a decade. Shi Wenshan was not a boss. Shi Wenshan was what bosses learned to kneel to, an international grandmaster at the peak of the transformation realm, a man who had not personally taken a contract in 10 years because there was nothing left in the world that could pay what his time was worth. The compound in Chiang Rai ran on his stillness. Long Yi prostrated at the edge of the pavilion and told him everything. A man in Hangzhou who killed Delta bosses with finger strikes. A man who had put a boy's body down in a rice paddy without leaving a mark. A jade talisman that stopped bullets at a throat. A son in the ground and a senior boss about to be replaced at a council table if the son stayed there. Shi Wenshan listened for a long time. Then he agreed. He did not agree for the money. The money did not matter to a man at his level. He agreed because the description Long Yi had brought him was the description of something Chinese martial mythology had been saying for a century did not exist any longer. Cultivators, true cultivators, not inner strength teachers, not grandmasters stepping over the transformation threshold. Someone much older, walking the earth under a new name. He wanted to see for himself. The phase closed on the Snake King stepping out of the private pavilion he had not left in 10 years. A Donghai-funded charter plane was already being arranged at an airstrip north of Chiang Rai. Long Yi was walking 3 steps behind his master with his head lowered. The compound's outermost perimeter was dismantling itself and loading into trucks. I was on my balcony again the night it happened. 3 time zones and a continent away, stabilized at mid-key refinement inside an array 3 times denser than Westlake, with my parents safe in a fold of the back ridge and Jinjiang's team inside a rift 500 kilometers south, and Sushan standing in Hangzhou with a spent pendant under his shirt. The outer ring of the siege was broken. The delta had settled. The photograph on the Donghai table had stopped moving because the man in the photograph had stepped out of the photograph and into a rice paddy and then back into his own house. I knew the next attack was coming. I had wanted it to come. I had let Long Yi board that flight because the boy with the gold chain was the wrong opponent and the father was the wrong opponent, and what I needed was the thing standing behind the father. The thing Chinese myth had been saying for a century could not still be walking. A transformation realm ceiling, come personally, carrying his own debts. I did not know his name yet. I would learn it soon enough. Across a jungle in northern Thailand, an old man was stepping out of a doorway he had not crossed in 10 years, and the air behind him was already beginning to move. I went into the rift myself. I had sent the Jin family in alone at the end of the last phase because the membrane at the outer rim could be walked through with a candle's worth of inner strength, and that was what Jinjiang's family could spare. The herbs I needed for the next seclusion sat deeper than a candle. They sat at the second ring, in a hollow where a mortal expedition would not last an afternoon. I waited for a night the stars laid themselves out in a configuration I remembered from an older life, and I walked to the mountain range 500 kilometers south of Hangzhou in the hour the mortal sex were still eating dinner, and I entered the realm alone. The air inside was thinner than Qinglong's and older. It smelled the way mountain air smells at 4,000 meters. High, clean, slightly metallic. I did not bring a light. I walked through the second ring, the way a man walks through rooms in a house he used to own. I found her at the edge of a wide basin, back against a stone wall, a short sword in her right hand. Her father's expedition of 6 men pressed behind her. A beast I had not seen on Earth yet, a 4-legged thing with scale down its back and a slow intelligence in its eyes, had cornered them. Jin Yuling's sword arm was shaking from the effort of holding a guard position past its useful span. She was peak external strength. I had been told it. I had not until that moment seen it. Her footwork was clean. Her breath was metered. She was 18 or 19, and she was going to be dead inside 3 minutes unless somebody did something. I did something. I crossed the basin without visibly moving, and I put 2 fingers through the beast's skull at the base of the horn, and the thing that had been drawing breath for 2 centuries stopped drawing it. The body went down in a heap that cracked the stone under it. Jin Yuling's sword came up toward my throat by reflex, then stopped halfway there because her eyes caught up with what her arm was doing. I knelt and put my palm flat against the stone an inch from her left foot. I sent 1 tendril of qi refinement sense through the ground and into her meridians, and read them the way a man reads a page in good light. Her spiritual roots were not the best I had ever seen. They were the best I had ever seen on Earth. I told her she was going to be a cultivator, not a martial artist, not a practitioner of internal strength. A cultivator, the old word, the thing Chinese mythology had been saying for 100 years, no longer existed. I told her I would accept her as an informal disciple, on the spot, without ceremony, if she agreed. She agreed before I finished the sentence. Her father, further back in the torchlight, was already kneeling to the stone, because Jin Jiang had lived long enough to understand what he was seeing. I taught her 3 core breath techniques in the space of an hour, with direct meridian contact, imprinting the patterns into her energy map the way a master seal presses into wax. Then, I took what I had come for from the hollow at the basin's far end, a root, 2 flowers, a slice of ore as thin as paper, and I walked back out of the rift the way I had come in. I did not see Jin Yuling again for 3 days. The attack on the Jin compound was at dawn. Luo Minghui came up the mountain road at the head of a 20-man strike team. He was a mid-tier family head from a rival medical clan, 2 provinces east, and he had taken a contract from a surviving Donghai sub-faction that could not wait for the Snake King's plane to land. The sub-faction had offered him full protection under the Snake King's authority once the master arrived. Luo Minghui was betting on becoming Donghai's Hangzhou man after I was dead. He had not bothered to read the part of the market report that explained what had happened to Hang Tiequan's courtyard. Jin Jiang's house had stood in Linhai for 300 years. It was mortal. 20 men with shallow ki and a numbers advantage broke the outer defenses inside 6 minutes. Jin Jiang met Luo Minghui at the inner hall. He was solid foundation establishment and no more. The fight lasted the length of a breath and a half. Luo Minghui's palm went through Jin Jiang's ribs the way a hand goes through paper. Jin Yuling, resisting on the stairs with the 3 breath techniques I had given her and a sword she barely had the strength to lift, was subdued, not broken, bound. Luo Minghui pinned a recorded message to the compound's ancestral shrine. 10 days. I was to arrive at a specified mountain shrine in a remote county, alone, unarmed. I was to surrender myself for negotiation, whatever that word meant in a recording, made by a man who had already killed a father. If I failed either condition, Jin Yuling would be executed in public. The compound was still burning when the message reached Qinglong. Su Hongyuan brought the transcript up the path himself. He was trembling. I took the transcript in my hand. I read it twice. I did not speak for several minutes. The stillness that came over my face was the stillness the narration had given Qinro Shui's memory in my first life. A second woman connected to me, placed on a countdown, and the old circuit in my chest lit up as if it had never stopped running. I had not felt that particular weight in 1,000 years. I felt it now. Then, I folded the paper and put it on the table, and I told Su Hongyuan I would leave on the 10th day, not a day earlier, not a day later. I would arrive at the shrine on the hour Luo Minghui had named. The Jin family seat was a vacuum Jin Yuling would occupy later under my banner, and no rushed rescue was going to change the shape of that. The 10 days were the 10 days I needed for the last of the seclusion. On the morning of the 10th day, I walked out of Qinglong's array room with the blood-red sword's memory construct seated a hair deeper inside my meridians than it had been, and I drove to the shrine alone. The shrine was on a high ridge above a dry river valley in a county no one visited except on clan holidays. Luo Minghui had picked the ground for its seclusion. It was good ground for somebody who expected a rescue party of 10. It was nothing at all for somebody who came with 1 man. I came alone. I came on time. I came technically unarmed because the only weapon I intended to bring was not a blade a mortal could search. I walked through the shrine's outer gate at the hour of Luo Minghui's demand, and I stopped at the edge of the courtyard. His full strike team was staged in the courtyard, with Jin Yuling kneeling, bound, at the center. Her left arm was broken at the elbow. The bandage on it was not clean. She was not crying. She was looking at me the way a student looks at a master who has arrived when the master said he would. Luo Minghui began his monologue. Terms, conditions, a speech that was going to run 8 minutes if he finished it. I interrupted him with one question, whether Jin Yuling had been physically harmed past the arm. He smirked and told me she had not been broken. Yet, I moved. I crossed the courtyard without visibly accelerating. 20 men. I had mapped the geometry with a sensory sweep before my second step. The stonework, the posts, the angle of the sun, the distance between any 2 men. The kill sequence was calculated before I began to walk. Luo Minghui's inner guard went first. 4 men at the corners of the center square. The first took a ruptured key core under the ribs. The second's own meridians locked his limbs against him, and he went down with his sword half drawn. The third crossed into the arc of the second's collapse. The fourth never moved at all. The outer perimeter saw the inner guard drop and broke their formation. That was the moment I did not need. I crossed through the broken line at a pace the narration can only call walking. The ring closed behind me because there was nothing alive behind me to hold it open. When I reached the far side, 20 men were arranged in a shape the survivors would later call a circle. There were no survivors. Luo Minghui was the last standing. I offered him 1 second, the name of the contracting Donghai sub-faction, confirmation of the arrangement he had taken. He talked. He talked the way a man talks when the number he has just become is 0. He gave me 3 names inside the second. He gave me the timing of the Snake King's plane. He gave me the address of the safe house in Hangzhou, where the sub-faction's ground team was waiting for the call. I killed him anyway. A live Luo Minghui, reporting back, poisoned the message I was sending upstream. A dead Luo Minghui, carrying the intelligence into the ground with him, closed the thread clean. The information I needed was already inside my head. I stepped around his body and walked across the bodies and reached Jin Yuling, where she was still bound at the center of the courtyard. I unbound her with one motion of my hand. The rope fell away from her wrists. Her broken arm I steadied with a sliver of ki through the joint. Not a heal. She would need a full session for that, but enough to kill the pain for the next hour. Then, I did the thing the narration has to mark carefully. I knelt to her. In the dust of the courtyard, with 20 men arranged around us in the circle I had drawn, I put my right knee on the stone, and I brought my eyes down below hers. I had not knelt once in either of my 2 lives. I had not knelt to my parents. I had not knelt at Qin Ruoshui's grave because she had no grave. I had not knelt at my master's feet in the Immortal realm because masters in that realm did not ask students to kneel. I knelt now. I told her the informal acceptance inside the rift was now formal. I named her my first disciple. I asked her to swear. She swore. Her voice was steady, and it did not shake once. She put her forehead on the back of my hand for a breath. Then I stood, and she stood, and her first act as formal disciple was to help me destroy every surveillance device at the shrine before we left. 2 days later, the Snake King arrived in China. He came on a Donghai-funded charter into a private strip outside Hangzhou. Long Yi was 3 steps behind him with his head lowered. The Snake King did not ride. He walked up the public road to Qinglong Manor at noon, under a sky gone flat and white with heat, and the word of his walking raced ahead of him. Xiaozhan and Xinggang were waiting at the gates. They were the 2 top mortal martial grandmasters in China, both called in during the preceding week by Su Hongyuan's contacts out of debt to the Su family. Both early-stage transformation. They were the last line the mortal martial world could put forward against a traitor who had walked out of China a decade ago at half step and come back at the peak. They had taken station at the Qinglong gates because their entire identity was top of the martial world, and they could not decline without losing that identity forever. They could not have won. They knew it. They fought anyway. Xiaozhan struck first. The exchange took 4 seconds. I will tell it in the shape of the count. 1. Xiaozhan's opening palm, a technique I will not name because it does not need a name. 2. The Snake King's left sleeve, moving 3 centimeters. 3. Xiaozhan's palm finding the sleeve, and the sleeve not finding anything worth finding back. 4. Xiaozhan on the ground, ribs caved in, alive by a margin the Snake King had chosen. The Snake King had not looked at him during the whole of the exchange. Xinggang attacked. 4 more seconds. 1. His sword, the same family sword Xinggang's grandfather had carried. 2. The Snake King's right hand opening at hip height. 3. The sword in 2 pieces on the flagstones. 4. Xinggang flat on his back, breathing, not moving, not going to move for the next hour. The Snake King walked past both of them without slowing down. His foot cleared Xinggang's wrist by less than a centimeter. He did not look down. He walked through the Qinglong gate into the manor grounds. The Donghai operational brief Long Yi had given him had the array room's location marked. He walked the path to the inner courtyard, the way a man walks to a room he has booked. I was still in seclusion. At the threshold of the inner courtyard, the exact courtyard where the spirit gathering array's center stone sat, on the ground I had laid with my own hands after the banquet in my 4th phase. The seclusion door opened. I walked out. The moment contained no introduction line. I had timed this. I had timed everything. The charter plane's landing, the walk up the road, Xiaozhan's 4 seconds, Xinggang's 4 seconds, the path through the grounds, the hour of the sun, the density of the array at its center stone. I had timed them all against one window, and the window was the one in which I stepped out of the door, and the Snake King was standing exactly 15 meters away on the array's central ring. I had what I needed. He had what he did not know he needed. I crossed the 15 meters in 3 steps. In my right hand, conjured from the memory construct I had seeded into my meridians during the last phase's seclusion and fed with every scrap of spare ki I had accumulated since the shrine, was the blood-red soul-destroying sword. It was the first time the sword had touched the air of Earth. It was thin as a rumor. Its edge was the color of old killing. I had forged it 3 times in my first life and lost it once, and its weight in my hand was the weight of 1,000 years, closing in a single afternoon. The Snake King recognized what the weapon was. His eyes changed. He had seen it, or something enough like it, in a story his master had told him when he was a boy. He had time for exactly 1 full breath, long enough to understand that the cultivator walking in the east was not a story after all. I struck once. The sword traced a single arc, snow on a long peak at the hour before dawn, a sleeve brushing against a wrist, a thread of silk parting under a thumb. The arc went from the Snake King's right collarbone down through his center line to a point below his navel, and the edge did not stop at any of the layers mortal anatomy would have expected it to stop at. He fell in 2 halves. The courtyard's spiritual ki density dropped audibly, like a glass of water tipped over. The wind moved in the shape the sword had cut. The 2 halves of what had been the Snake King landed on the flagstones a meter apart and did not move again. I did not look at them. I turned toward the manor's outer gate. Long Yi was on the road outside. He had arrived with the Snake King and had been waiting on the gravel because a man like him did not enter a house the master had not entered first. He had heard, through the thin walls of distance that operate at that tier, the exact moment the Snake King stopped existing. His hand was at his chest. He was a kilometer away through 2 stone walls and a ridge of old pine. I raised my right hand. I closed it into a fist. I drove the fist downward through the mass of ki I had gathered for the sword and not quite spent. The compression left my knuckles in the shape of what, In the old language, we called a mountain falling. It crossed a kilometer in a fraction of a second the clocks of Earth did not have a mark for. Long Yi, standing on the gravel with one hand still at his chest, was struck through the ribs and died standing up. 2 men, one afternoon. Sushan and Jin Yuling came running across the inner courtyard 30 seconds later because they had heard the quiet. Sushan's hand reached my shoulder and stopped there. Xiaozhan and Xinggang, still alive at the outer gate, were being carried back to a waiting car by their own men. They would live, they would walk, by next week. They would tell the story of what they had seen in Qinglong's courtyard for the rest of their lives. The news of the 2 deaths crossed the Chinese martial world inside 48 hours. A peak transformation realm grandmaster, bisected in a Hangzhou courtyard in a single sword arc. A Donghai senior boss, dead at a kilometer's distance from a fist. Every mid-tier operator in 3 provinces learned the same sentence. Whatever ceiling they had been standing under, the new ceiling was a man in a Qinglong courtyard. I stood on the flagstones a long time. Somewhere across the years, I had held a woman's sleeve to my wrist while a mountain fell around us, and the sleeve had smelled of plum. The Snake King would never have heard that name. He had died not knowing what he had been killed for. It was not personal. He had been the door. I had walked through him the way I was going to walk through everything else. I sheathed the blood-red sword back into the memory construct inside my meridians. I had knelt once in 2 lives, in a shrine courtyard ringed with 20 dead men, to a girl with a broken arm in the dust. I would not kneel again. The girl would remember it. The ground would remember it. Then I turned and I went to find my parents in the back mountain refuge, and I told them what had happened, and I told them the siege was over. The siege was over. The array had gone quiet. My parents were safe. My disciple was standing at my left. The first half of the story was done. I went back inside. The Snake King had been dead 3 weeks when I opened the doors of Qinglong Pharmaceutical to the public. We did it on a Hangzhou Friday at noon in a glass plaza my architects had carved out of the Delta River frontage so the reporters would have clean light. Su Hongyuan stood at the ribbon with half his hair black and a cane he no longer needed and said nothing at all, which was better than anything he could have said. Su Shui cut the ribbon. Su Shan stood 1 pace behind me on the left and did not smile. The pill I had spent 2 phases quietly perfecting, a mild taste alchemical compound diluted down to mortal accessible dosages, went onto the counter in rows of clean white boxes, and inside 90 minutes, the first day's stock had sold out. I watched the queue from a window on the 2nd floor and noted the 3 regional health officials who came to buy personally rather than send assistants. The brand was real before the first advertisement aired. 48 hours later, we opened the Donghai demonstration. I picked Donghai on purpose. Long Yi had run that city for a decade, and Long Yi was 2 provinces in the ground, and the vacuum he had left behind was the exact shape of a market. Brand sits better on vacuum than flag does. Su Shan's eastern operators had been absorbing Long Yi's old network in quiet 3-week increments, and by the time Su Shui stepped onto the Donghai exhibition stage, every second man in that crowd worked a line I could trace back to her cousin's jacket. The staged poisoning started before her opening sentence finished. I was still in the Buick minivan, 2 blocks out, when the first stretchers appeared. The intermediary was a woman the Donghai papers would later name only as Sister Hong, and her script was straight out of a third-rate playbook. 8 men carried in on 2 stretchers, 4 victims clutching their chests, a burly man roaring about poisoned children, a woman who wept on cue and threatened to break her skull on the company's front doors if someone did not answer for her family. Pre-placed Donghai media crew at both corners of the plaza, microphones cutting off the moment Su Shui tried to speak. The Yu family had paid for it. I would have the names inside 6 hours, but the frame was the thing. A 90-second video of a crying woman in front of a Qinglong logo, and the brand would bleed 6 months of value before the lawyers even opened their files. I had expected this class of attack since the day I named the company. I let it run. I had the driver stop the Buick at the edge of the plaza, and I walked the last half block through a crowd that was being herded toward hysteria by planted agitators muttering the same 3 sentences every 10 meters. I watched who said them. I made a list. Then I walked up onto the stage through the gap in the security line, and I stood next to Su Shui until her shoulders came down a centimeter, and I took the microphone from her hand without looking at the burly man who was still roaring. I reached into my pocket. The vial was glass, the solution inside the color of weak tea. I had refined it myself 3 weeks earlier, back at the manor, for exactly this class of contingency. Real toxins leave biochemical signatures. The antidote metabolizes inside seconds. Faked poisonings leave nothing to metabolize, so the reactive compound does not kindle. The The distinction is chemical, not theatrical. A real patient recovers on contact. A faker stays exactly as he was. I walked down the stage and onto the plaza floor, and I put 3 drops on the lips of each man on the stretchers. 2 of them sat up inside a heartbeat. Real patients. Low-dose shellfish, poisoning the faker hadn't planned for, brought along because she needed bodies that looked sick. Both men thanked me in the kind of dazed voice that cannot be faked. The other 2 did not move at all, because there was nothing chemically wrong with them, because they were actors on salary. That was the footage the Donghai camera crew had filmed, and the footage that was now going to destroy the people who had paid for it. Su Shan's operators moved in from the crowd before the camera crew got halfway to their van. Detained. Footage handed to the Qinglong legal team inside the hour. The burly man and the weeping woman and Sister Hong's 3 planted agitators vanished back into the crowd for exactly 47 minutes before Su Shan's people brought them back in a van of their own. The Yu family collapsed in 72 hours. I did not attend the arrests. Su Shui handled the press. Su Hongyuan handled the health administration. The captured footage handled the rest. Sister Hong broke on the second interview. The Yu family's stock halved inside a trading day. Their principal executive roster faced health code and pharmaceutical forgery charges before the Friday. The son, Yu Wei, I dealt with personally at a Donghai reception that I will not bother to narrate in full. A slap, a stomp, a broken leg, a 3-day ultimatum. His father came with a grandmaster in tow, recognized the name Lin Chongqing at a glance, and beat his own son in public before bowing to me. The seal on Qinglong Pharmaceutical was lifted before dawn. Medicinal herbs arrived at my gate in apology boxes inside the week. Donghai's pharmaceutical market was mine. Every corporate rival inside 1,000 miles read the collapse timeline and recalibrated. No one tried that kind of attack again on Qinglong for the rest of the story. A coordinating meeting took me to Yunnan 4 weeks later. A second secret realm, the Myanmar Rift, in a sliver of jungle just across the northern Myanmar border, was scheduled to open its window. The Chinese martial world, still digesting the Snake King's death and my new ceiling, had organized a joint expedition under a loose consortium rubric. Each sect sends 1 team. Resource splits. Follow contribution. The window is narrow, and the consequences of going alone are consequences no sect wants to eat. I took Jin Yuling, left arm healed, high ponytail back, short sword at her hip, eyes clearer than when I had named her, and flew down to the old tea garden where Bai Gu had called everyone together. Bai Gu ran the meeting clean. 1 table, 1 set of rules, no internal looting, group travel through the membrane, mutual aid on environmental hazards, central chamber herbs on a first touch basis. I listened through the clauses and watched the faces and said nothing until my own expedition's team size was read into the record as 4, which meant me and Jin Yuling and 2 herb handlers, which meant the meeting had named me the center of gravity without saying the words. There was 1 key signature in the room that did not match the clauses. Chen Nengguan sat at the second table, head of a southwestern medical clan with old grievances against the Jin family. Jin Zhang had crossed his father's brother in a provincial pharmacopoeia vote 20 years ago, and the clan's ledger on that page had never closed. He nodded through every clause. He raised no objection. His kui fluctuated in the exact pattern a man's kui fluctuates when he is smiling with his mouth and cataloging kill vectors with the part of his mind a meridian reader can see in the 3rd register. Anger masking compliance. I had seen it 100 times in 100 courts across 2 lives. I mapped the rhythm of his breath and filed the name. Jin Yuling saw nothing. Her training did not reach that register yet. I briefed her that night in the hotel. I gave her 3 names, Chen Nengguan and the 2 southwestern clan operators he was most likely to pair with, and I gave her their builds and their probable openings, and I told her what she was about to walk into. She asked 1 question. She asked whether I would be with her. I told her I would be 1 level above in the rift's vertical geometry, harvesting the central chamber herb I had come for, which would occupy me for approximately 90 minutes in which she would be on her own. She did not flinch. She said she understood. She did. I did not tell her the last part, that the ceiling between peak external strength and foundation establishment is the 1 rung of her cultivation that cannot be crossed in a safe environment. That foundation establishment breaks under live stakes combat stress, or it does not break at all. That a rescue at the wrong second would seal her ceiling where it was, and I would carry a senior disciple at peak external strength for the rest of the series. That the choice I was asking of her she would not have agreed to if I had named it. I kept that part to the side of my mouth and let the briefing end. The rift opened on schedule, 90 minutes into the expedition, with my party a level above in the central chamber, and Jin Yuling leading the lower sweep. Chen Nangguan's 3 hand-picked operators closed around her smaller group, with a rift hazard framing already half-drafted in their heads. 3 swords, 3 early-stage transformation men, against an 18-year-old disciple at peak external strength. I was watching in key space. My sense at mid to late key refinement maps the full chamber inside a 3-second latency. I saw the first of the 3 move before Jin Yuling did. I did not move. She moved. Her footwork opened with the second of the 3 core breath techniques I had imprinted into her energy map inside the first rift. Her sword came off the hip in the cadence I had drilled on the manor grounds, and she took the nearest operator across the wrist before his blade had cleared his scabbard. Blood. First cut. She did not look at it. She stepped inside the second operator's arc and let his momentum carry him past her own body the way I had taught her to read it, and her return stroke opened him from the ribs through to the far shoulder. 2 down inside 15 seconds. The third was smarter. The third went wide, drew her toward the chamber wall, tried to turn the geometry against her. She let him. She let him right up to the edge, and then she crossed her own breath in the middle of a strike, and I felt the ceiling give, felt the floor of Foundation establishment open under her like a door, felt her key map reorganize itself around the new register mid-motion, and the third operator walked into a cut that had a foot more reach than the cut he had prepared to parry. He died on his own step. She stood in the chamber with 3 bodies around her, and her left arm shaking from the breakthrough, and her eyes wider than I had ever seen them. Chen Nangguan descended as insurance. The second operator went down. He had been crouched a level above all 3, waiting on whichever of his operators needed a kill fourth. He expected to finish a wounded disciple, while the Chinese martial world's ledger read clean rift hazard. I stepped across his path at the threshold. He did not know it was me until I was already in front of him. His kui did the thing a man's ki does when he has understood, in a quarter of a second, that the floor he was walking on is not floor. I took him with one gesture. I did not draw the blood-red sword. I did not need to. A closed hand at the sternum, and the kai compression, the old language calls a small peak falling, and Chen Nangguan was down without his third operator having finished falling. I killed him rather than letting Jin Yuling take the corpse. The dead man needed to be my kill, not hers. Surviving Southwestern clan grievance rolls upstream at me. I can absorb it, not at an 18-year-old first disciple who cannot. I walked down the chamber steps. I retrieved the herb I had come for from the central niche. I knelt next to Jin Yuling, long enough to steady the new floor under her key map with a sliver of my own. She did not speak. She did not have to. I told her what she had crossed. I told her the names of the 2 registers she would need to stabilize across the next week. Then, we walked out of the rift. She was 1 ceiling higher than the disciple who had walked in. The 19 days after the Myanmar rift, I spent inside the manor's array room. The herb from the central chamber went into the compound I had been assembling since Phase 4, the last threshold ingredient. I refined the pills on the spirit array, consumed them one by one across the seclusion window, and let the heavenly woodling holy technique open the gate between chi refinement and tongsuan that had been sitting 1 breath under my Danian for 3 phases. On the 19th night, a little before the hour of the rat, the gate gave. The ground did not break. The air pressure in the inner courtyard shifted by a measurable degree. Low-frequency oscillation crossed the array's outer ring and propagated outward through the bedrock at a frequency band that overlapped ground vibration, and seismic stations in 3 provinces registered a tremor they could not locate to any fault. Dogs across Hangzhou went silent for 90 seconds. The lake behind the manor rose 2 centimeters along the stone edge, for no reason the mortal survey could identify. The array's central stone warmed to the touch. Jin Yuling, who had been waiting outside the seclusion door for 3 days on the instruction I had left her before I went in, be here when it opens, later said the silence that ran across the grounds in those 90 seconds was not absence of sound. It was sound gone thin. I do not know how she knew that at 18. I knew what she meant. I opened the door at dawn. She was still on the step where I had left her. She bowed. Su Hongyuan, told the news inside the hour, was quiet for a long time. The quiet of a man who has understood, finally, what he had bet his family on. My parents came down from the back mountain refuge. My mother asked if I had eaten. I had not. She fed me. The news crossed the Chinese cultivation and martial networks inside 72 hours. The witnesses were the dogs and the seismic stations and the lake. The summary sentence every grandmaster in the East passed along ran clean. The man in the Qinglong courtyard is not above the transformation realm anymore. He is a named realm. Tongsuan, profound understanding, a tier whose Qi output displaces air at radius and whose breakthroughs are felt in the ground under mortal feet. Every clan considering a challenge recalibrated that week. The surviving Southwestern network, already down one Chen Nangguan, closed its file on the matter for a year. The Donghai remnants did not move. The Yu family did not move. No one moved. I went back inside the array room and stood for a long time on the central stone. The door to the cultivation world had not opened. It was not going to open for a while yet, but the road to it had one less gate between me and its base, and the promise I had made to Qinro Shui on a ruin 1,000 years ago was one stone closer to paid. I walked up the path to tell my parents where the next seclusion would sit. The second half of the story was ready to begin. 6 weeks after the Tongsuan gate opened, I went south to Taijiang. Qinglong Pharmaceutical had the Hangzhou Donghai corridor sewn up, and the Yu family's collapse had traveled outward at the speed of a rumor. But the southwestern medical clans were a different country. The Zhang family, the Chen family, the Wen family, and a dozen smaller lineages. Old names, old ledgers, old grudges. Their biennial exchange opens every other spring inside a walled academic compound in Taijiang County. At the foot of a mountain the Miao locals call Leigong. If I wanted my brand to matter south of the Yangtze by winter, I had to walk in through their gate myself. Market access in that part of the country is cut in rooms a man has to be physically standing in. A junior partner would have come home with junior terms. I took Jin Yuling and no one else. We flew to Chen City at dawn and drove the last stretch into Taijiang through a late afternoon that went quiet the deeper we got. I had not been this far from Hangzhou since Fu County, and the road between the two places is long enough to forget how narrow the delta feels from the outside. The hills rose and dulled into a hazed blue. Rice terraces stepped down the slopes in cut pale green bands. The old country, the country that was already old when I walked it in the first life. I let the cultivation world imagery come back to my throat the way it used to. A sleeve of cloud across a peak, a river bent inside its own wrist, and I kept the rest of it to myself. The exchange's registration hall was a long stone building trimmed with faded red lacquer and crowded to the door with clan heads, second-generation heirs, and regional administrators shaking one another's hands in the practiced way men shake hands in rooms where every grip is a count of debt. Jin Yuling signed our names. I stood beside her with my hands at my sides. I was halfway through the third stroke of my own surname when I felt the man across the hall stop breathing. I did not look up immediately. I let the qi around him speak first. Chen Jingwen, head of the Chen family, a name I had turned over in a private ledger of medical world grievances more than once. A man who had stood at the edge of a Jiangnan Pharmacopoeia vote 20-odd years ago and let the Jin family lose a seat they should not have lost, and whose clan had been rehearsing its defense against a Jin reprisal for as long as Jin Yuling had been alive. Formally accepting a disciple transfers the master's protection downward and the disciple's grievances upward. It is not sentiment, it is the structure. Jin Yuling's old debts were mine. His old silence was mine to collect. He understood what had walked into the conference inside the length of one breath. I watched him turn away from the registration table and put a hand on the sleeve of a Wen family man beside him and say something short. Old money medical clan heads do not run when they see what he saw. They convene. By the time Jin Yuling handed me back my pen, Chen Jingwen was already walking toward the eastern wing of the compound, where the Zhang delegation had their suites. I had not yet signed my second name, and the coalition was already forming. I finished the signature and went to my room. The next 3 days ran the way the skeleton of that sort of thing always runs. The first morning, the Wen family pushed a senior disciple forward during the opening panel and had him question Jin Yuling's medical credentials in front of 100 people. The boy was handsome, practiced, armed with names and dates, and the small cultivated sneer that old clans teach their heirs. Jin Yuling answered in 2 sentences. She named her foundation establishment realm, and she named her master in that order, and she sat down. The boy's face went through 3 colors, and the panel moved on. Credential challenge neutralized. The second morning, during the product showcase, a Zhang family pharmaceutical executive stood up in the middle of Qinglong's presentation and questioned the compound purity of our flagship pill. I had expected this variant. I let him finish his sentence. Then I had the attendants set a single Qinglong diagnostic pill on a small porcelain plate in front of every seated attendee, and I invited the conference, any of them, all of them, to break the pill open on the table and test for themselves. No one moved for a long second. Then, the oldest alchemist in the room did what old alchemists do. The pill was clean. The pill was better than clean. The Zhang executive sat down under 100 pairs of eyes and did not speak again for the rest of the showcase. Purity challenge neutralized. The third evening, at the welcome banquet, a lesser clan representative, whose name I no longer bother to remember, walked past my chair and poured a cup of tea down my sleeve. She smiled while she did it. Tea on a Tongsuan-level cultivator's sleeve evaporates the moment it lands. I did not stand up. I did not change my expression. I let my cup warm an inch. I made a single quiet arrangement with Su Hui's people over the phone the next morning that by the end of the week, every distribution channel Qinglong operated west of Sichuan was closed to her clan. Her province would feel the missing shipments inside a month. She was still smiling at the banquet when I left. Blacklist set. I let the 3 days burn one after the other, and by the fourth morning, the coalition Chen Jingwen had spent the first evening stitching together was cracking along every seam. The Wen family pulled back. The smaller clans stopped returning his pages. I could have ended it faster. I chose not to. Ending it on the first morning would have cemented the coalition against Qinglong for a decade. Letting it burn itself out, one small humiliation at a time, would leave the Southwest amenable in the aftermath. The graduated provocations were met with graduated responses, and the ledger stayed clean. Zhang Chuan decided to accelerate. Zhang Jiahui's son, young, handsome, arrogant in the particular way a boy raised above reproach learns to be arrogant. He had sat through 3 days of watching his father's allies retreat. He had watched Jin Yuling's short reply to the Wen disciple at the opening panel and had taken it personally, as if her foundation establishment were some kind of judgment on his own training. By the fourth evening, he had decided the conference would break in the Zhang family's favor, only if he broke it himself. He waited for me in the corridor, outside the private dining wing. He had chosen the place with a fraction of a thought, and none of the ones that mattered. The corridor was narrow, lit by 2 old bronze lanterns, and empty except for a single servant carrying a tray of cups and a Wen family representative passing through on the way to her own suite. He was alone by design. He wanted a quick verbal confrontation he could turn into a scandal in the morning. His opening insult targeted a woman 1,000 years in the ground. Chen Jingwen had briefed him that morning. The rumor Chen Jingwen had been passing through the coalition for 3 days was a grossly inaccurate story about what he called my dead mistress and Zhang Chuan, who had never once in his sheltered life met a line he could not cross, said her name loudly in the middle of the corridor, the way a boy says a name he has been told will land. He said the name Qinro Shui, and he put a word in front of it that does not need to be written down. I did not look at his face. I looked at my own hand, the hand that had held the heavenly venerate's sword in a ruin 1,000 years ago, the hand that had closed her eyes on a ridge after the siege, the hand she had knocked aside with her own sleeve when the killing blow was coming for me and taken it instead. That hand. I watched the air around my index finger compress and thin, and the space between my knuckle and his jaw become a single thread of absence. The cut opened his face from temple to chin. He did not understand what had happened for a full second. Then his hand came up to his cheek, and the blood came with it, and he went down on the corridor stone screaming in the voice of a boy who has never been hurt before. The servant dropped the tray. The Wen family representative stopped walking. 2 witnesses in clean light. By morning, the entire conference would know. The wound was unreconstructible by any surgery that existed in that country or any country. The Tongsuan-level key compression had parted his skin along a line that no modern technique would be able to close without leaving the exact shape of his face ruined for the rest of his life. I had not killed him. I had not intended to. A murder inside a conference corridor would have locked the entire exchange into a state investigation. A disfigured heir could propagate under his own family's control and let the conference's political ecosystem absorb the event on its own terms. The slash was not a loss of composure. It was the exact measured response to the one line, the one protected line, the only one. I stepped over him and I went back to my room. Zhang Jiahui arrived in Taijiang by private plane inside 6 hours of his son's hospitalization. He demanded a formal conference session the next morning to arbitrate. I accepted. The session opened in the main hall of the academic compound at 10, with the presiding elders seated along the long lacquered table at the head of the room, and the entire exchange. Every clan head, every heir, every administrator who had attended the banquet, standing in concentric rings around the outer walls. Zhang Chuan had been brought on a stretcher into a chair at the side of the hall at my condition, a cloth across the lower half of his face, his eyes not quite focused. Zhang Jiahui opened with grievance. He was a man in his middle years, with silver at his temples and the voice of a clan patriarch in a room full of men who had known him 30 years, and he used all of it. I let him finish. Then I had the servant from the corridor speak. Then I had the Wen family representative speak. Then I sat forward in my chair and spoke, once, plainly, the single sentence Zhang Chuan had said, and the name he had said before it. The hall went quiet in the particular way halls go quiet when every person in them understands, simultaneously, that the line being discussed is one none of them would have crossed. The presiding elders ruled within the hour. The insult itself was indefensible. The Zhang family had no standing to arbitrate the response. Zhang Jiahui knew what that ruling meant for his family's continued presence in the southwestern medical pipeline before the elders finished speaking. I did not demand the Zhang family's withdrawal. Total destruction of a clan that old would trigger survivor grievances for 2 generations. I spoke the survival conditions instead. The Zhang family would remain a clan. It would no longer be a medical force. The amputation would be internal. Zhang Chuan, whose conduct had disqualified the lineage, would be permanently removed from the family's cultivation and medical inheritance. On that condition, and only on that condition, the Zhang name would survive the next week intact. The hall waited. Zhang Jiahui sat for a long moment, with both hands flat on the table in front of him. He was a patriarch of a 1,000-year clan, and the calculation a patriarch of a 1,000-year clan makes in a moment like that is not the calculation a father makes. The 1,000 years weigh more than the one son. He understood. He stood up. He walked across the hall to the chair where they had set his son. The narration slows here because the moment asks for it. He did not speak to Zhang Chuan. Zhang Chuan did not speak to him. The boy saw his father's face and saw in 10 seconds what was coming and understood. And the understanding was the paralysis, not the technique. A parent's meridian intimacy with the child they raised makes the act mechanically simple. Zhang Jiahui was himself at foundation establishment. The Zhang family's internal cultivation reached there. He placed 2 fingers below his son's ribs. At the center of the line, a cultivator's cultivation runs through. He held them there for the length of 1 breath. Then he pressed. The boy's cultivation ended. He would not cultivate again. He would not refine another pill. He would live out the rest of his life as a mortal in a family of medical practitioners and watch the rest of his generation pass him on the stairs. The father stepped back from the chair. He did not look at his son. He turned to the elders and bowed, a long, full bow, and announced, in the voice of a man whose voice was failing him, the Zhang family's withdrawal from medical practice for the current generation. The hall was silent for a long count. The presiding elders accepted the withdrawal. At the back of the room, Chen Jingwen stood with his hand on the wall. His face had gone the color of paper sometime during the arbitration and not changed since. He had understood, the instant Zhang Jiahui had placed his fingers, that the coalition he had stitched together on the first evening was finished. He would survive the next week. He would not contest me again. The Chen family would remain a name. The grievance would go silent. We left Taijiang the next morning. Jin Yuling did not speak for most of the drive back to Chen City. When she finally did, on a switchback through the hills, it was to ask me once, quietly, whether the name I had heard in the corridor would be carried now in every subsequent room we walked into, and whether it would travel in the national rumor mill with the instruction added beside it, "Do not speak of that name." I said yes. She did not ask anything else. The southwestern medical pipeline was ours. By the time we landed in Hangzhou, the Chen family was silent. The Zhang family had withdrawn. The smaller clans submitted individually to Qinglong distribution terms through quiet intermediaries across the following week, and the Wen family's head sent a formal apology note, hand-delivered by a 3rd-generation nephew. The conference's political ecosystem had absorbed the event exactly as the calculation had predicted. I walked into the back mountain refuge and sat with my parents for a long evening. My mother asked if I had eaten. I had. She fed me anyway. My father poured tea. I did not tell them where I had been or what had happened there. They did not ask. Late that night, in the array room, I stood on the central stone and let the quiet settle. The first time her name had been spoken against me on page in 2 lives had been answered. The trigger was set. The grammar of the next phases was already reorganizing around it in the Chinese rumor networks, and the line had become a law of physics, the way the Tongsuan breakthrough had become a law of physics. Measurable, carried by witnesses, uncontestable. 1 gate closer, 1 stone closer. The road south was open. The road north was next. The road south had closed in Taijiang. The road north opened the way roads do when the man at the end of it does not yet know he is already beaten. I spent the first month after Taijiang on low-profile regional work. Qinglong Pharmaceutical had a dozen small provincial frictions that had been allowed to run because the Zhang family engagement consumed my bandwidth. I cleared them in 3 provinces in 3 weeks without speaking above a normal voice in any single room. Pricing disputes with 2 smaller clans along the middle Yangtze. A distribution corridor question in the Far East that a local official had misunderstood as leverage. A licensing matter in the pharmaceutical regulator's southern office that resolved the moment the right name was used. I cultivated Jin Yuling's foundation establishment a little deeper in the evenings between flights. I sat quiet meals with my parents in the back mountain refuge on the nights I was home. The register of the house held. The register of my own breath held. I let the Southwest absorb what had happened in Taijiang on its own time, and I stayed out of its way while it did. Sushan was not in the Hangzhou-Donghai corridor. He had taken 3 of his crew to the northern border to close a distribution corridor against a local mafia faction that had been skimming Qinglong shipments out of 2 freight depots along the rail line. The intelligence brief had the opposition listed at mid-tier underworld, nothing the Sushan of late Phase 7 could not handle with a knife and a clean morning. The brief was wrong. The call came through to the back mountain refuge at roughly 4 in the afternoon. Sushan had been ambushed at a warehouse checkpoint by a Grandmaster-level mercenary paid off ledger. The attacker had come through the side wall on a timing the Su Crew's point man had not seen. He had killed 2 of Sushan's men in the first exchange and broken a third's collarbone in the second. Sushan had lived because Sushan had always been harder to kill than men several tiers above him, and because the Grandmaster had been too confident in the opening pass. They had traded blows for the better part of a minute. By the time the Grandmaster pulled back, Sushan had put enough sustained damage into the man's ribs to force a withdrawal. His arm had come off at the shoulder during the final exchange. The brief said his crew's field medics had the stump packed with hemostatic agents inside 90 seconds. Clean protocol, modern emergency medicine handling a 21st century wound. They had him on air transport within an hour. The arm was packed in ice for a surgery that could not put it back. The mercenary had escaped wounded. Lin Luo's Tongsuanqi sensing range did not extend to the northern border in real time. Sushan had not been carrying a second jade. The escape was a failure mode that belonged to me. I stood in the back mountain refuge's study with the phone still against my ear, and I did not speak. The stillness was the same stillness that had come to me twice before. Once, when I read the brief that said Jin Yuling had been taken. Once, when Xiao Zhan came down the ridge. The third time, it came easier. That is the danger of it. I gave 4 orders inside the next 12 minutes, and I was on a plane to the northern safe house before dawn. The pill I brought with me was the one I had refined in the post-Tongsuan seclusion, precisely for this contingency. I had not named it on paper. I named it once, quietly, on the flight, for the line it would land on. A cultivation world regeneration compound, scaled down to this world's meridian pressure. The pill stabilized a severed limb's stump tissue, synchronized its key pattern against a donor matrix, and regrew the severed structure through 48 hours of guided key circulation. In the cultivation world, it was standard field medicine. On Earth, it was a miracle, and I would not be able to make one like it until Divine C. I was glad I had made this one. I reached the safe house inside 12 hours of the ambush. Sushan was on a cot in a back room, with his shoulder bandaged and his eyes open. I told him in a short sentence what the pill would do and what I would need from him. He nodded once. His mouth moved. I leaned closer. "Thank you," he said. I told him to save it. I gave him the pill with a measured push of true ki through his system to take the shock down, and he was unconscious inside the minute. The regeneration required him unconscious for the first 24 hours. I sat in the chair beside the cot, and I did not leave the room. The first 12 hours were bone. The stump's tissue reorganized along the original meridian track, and the new bone extended from the clavicle out the way bone is supposed to grow, slow, deliberate, one cell layer at a time, with my palm held over the shoulder to keep the chi circulation even. The skin closed over the growing structure as it extended. Hour 18, the fingers articulated for the first time. Hour 24, the nerve function returned in a single pass from shoulder to fingertip, and Sushan opened his eyes without a sound and looked at his hand and looked at me. He did not speak for a long time. When he did speak, he asked me how, I told him. I used the words for what they were: regeneration compound, guided meridian synchronization, cultivation world grade. He nodded and said he understood, and I understood that he did not understand and would not be asking the same question again. Something in him had rearranged. It was not the arm. It was the quiet private conclusion about what kind of being his brother Luo actually was. I let him sit with it. While the rest of the regeneration completed, I issued the public statement. It went out through the Qinglong Communications channel in the short form. It named the mercenary by his operational alias, and it named the Du family of longmen as the sponsor network behind the off-ledger payment route. The attribution had been traced by Su Shan's intelligence apparatus through 3 shell accounts inside 48 hours, and the line to Du Yiyang was clean. The statement named Du Yiyang by name. It said that in 1 month's time, I would present myself at the Du family's longmen seat, alone, to discuss the sponsor relationship face to face. It said that Su Shan, now whole, would accompany me as the only witness. A private confrontation with the Du family would have ended in a private body count. A public announcement forced Du Yiyang to choose between public submission and public fight, and both ended his sponsor network regardless of outcome. The 1-month window was deliberate. I wanted the whole of the Chinese martial world to arrive on time. They arrived on time. The 4 weeks between the announcement and the Longmen Day ran the way 4 weeks run when a thing that cannot be stopped is approaching, and everyone in the country understands that attendance is identity. The Tang family sent senior representatives. The Wen family sent 3. The Chen remnants sent their cleanest elder. The Qinling sects came down off their mountains for the first time in a generation. The Beijing-adjacent formal orders sent observers. The Southwest clans that had submitted after Taijiang sent heirs. Xiao Zhan came, the first time he had shown his face in public since the Qinglong Gate, and came as witness, not combatant. Xing Gang came with him, walking unaided. Neither man spoke to me before the day. Jin Yuling did not come. I had told her to hold the back mountain refuge with my parents. She had nodded once. She understood the arithmetic. The compound perimeter was the one line I would not let drift, while the entire martial world converged somewhere else. She stood at the refuge gate the morning I left, and she watched the car turn down the mountain road, and she did not say anything, and I did not say anything, and we both understood the weight of the silence. Du Yiyang spent his month the way a man spends his last month when he refuses to know it is his last. He fortified the Longmen compound. He reinforced the private arena on the high terrace. He made calls. He made many calls. He had decades of sponsor relationships across central China, and he worked them one by one, asking for fighters, for witnesses, for a single operator willing to stand beside him on the day. The calls came back empty. Every contact willing to answer declined to associate with what was coming. The calculation was simple, and every operator ran it the same way. Tongsuan's ceiling is visibly above the available ally ceiling, and aligning with Du is betting against the inevitable. By the last week of the month, his sponsor network of decades had produced 0 reinforcements. He stood on the Longmen Terrace the morning of the confrontation with his personal guard and no one else. The outer perimeter of the compound was ringed 3 deep by then. The senior clans were closest to the terrace. The secondary regional observers stood in the middle band. Ordinary citizens had climbed the foothills and watched from the outer rim with cell phones and drones. The terrace was visible from every rise around the valley, and the public record was already out of the Du family's hands. Several state-level observers were present informally, tracking the gathering for policy purposes. The story's own country was watching the way a country watches an event that is about to redraw its map. I walked up the mountain road at the arranged hour with Su Shan beside me. No entourage, no honor guard. 2 men walking toward a fortified compound full of cameras. The image was the whole point. Du Yiyang stood at the terrace's opposite edge, in the traditional stance of a clan head awaiting a challenger. I reached the center of the terrace, and I stopped. I did not speak first. I waited. He delivered the prepared opening. He issued the challenge in the traditional martial clan form, citing the mercenary matter as a pretext and demanding combat to settle the question of my jurisdiction over Du family internal affairs. He spoke for nearly a minute. I let him speak. My reply was 3 sentences. I named the mercenary by his operational alias. I named the Du family payment route, the 3 shell accounts in the order the money had moved through them. I named the specific Du family asset who had signed off on the contract. I did not raise my voice. By the 3rd sentence, Du Yiyang's face had changed, and every witness in the outer rings had understood what that change meant. The combat was no longer about jurisdiction. The combat was about whether he had any position left to defend. He attacked anyway. What followed was approximately 90 seconds. I did not strike. I did not move my feet. I stood on the center stone of the terrace with my hands at my sides, and I let the Tongshuan Qi field do the work. Every strike Du Yiyang threw slid off the field without registering contact. Every technique a Du family head learns in a lifetime of training arrived at the surface of the field and stopped there. The Ching Chung fiery palm that had made him famous 2 decades ago dispersed an inch from my shoulder. The spearhand strikes, all 7 variants of the line his grandfather had brought down off the mountain, never reached. He could not touch me. The strikes accelerated. Then they went ragged. Then they went desperate. His Qi reservoir emptied against nothing, and his body slowed, and his breath broke. At roughly the 60-second mark, his eyes changed. The mental break was the moment he registered that his own strikes could not reach their target. Everything after that was the body finishing a motion the mind had already abandoned. He stopped. He stepped back from me. He did not look at me. He turned in the terrace's full silence, and he faced his own assembled Du family elders at the side of the platform. His hand went to the saber at his hip, the personal saber, the one the Du family head had carried for 6 generations, a blade inscribed with the family's own internal energy patterns and set with the Du line's oldest key lock. He drew it in one motion. The saber knew his meridians the way a weapon only knows a hand it has belonged to for a lifetime. He turned the edge inward. The narration slows here because this moment also asks for it. He did not look at his elders. He did not look at his son. He drove the saber's edge through his own dantian in a single clean inward stroke, exactly at the angle a cultivator who wishes to end his own cultivation inscribes on himself when he chooses the act over submission. The self-inflicted version preserved what remained of the Du family honor lineage. A family head who submits visibly under another cultivator's hand erases 200 years of clan authority. A family head who crushes his own cultivation in recognition of an unwinnable fight preserves the clan's internal narrative. He chose the clan's narrative. The saber completed the line. His knees went down, and the blade stayed with him. I waited for the act to complete. Then I spoke, short, addressed not to the broken man at the terrace edge, but to the Du family elders assembled at the side. I said the family would survive. I said the sponsor network was dissolved. Every operator on every ledger, every payment route closed. The mercenary pipeline shuttered the same day. I said the head position would pass, today, to whichever elder among them had clean hands to hold it. I did not wait for them to choose him. The family bows its own heads. One did, and the others did, and the matter was set. The 3-ring audience began to disperse. I turned and walked out of the Du compound with Su Shan beside me. The state-level observers made their notes. The ordinary citizens along the ridge lowered their cameras. The senior clans had already begun the calculations that would consume them for the next week. Xiao Zhan met my eyes once as I passed the inner ring. He inclined his head a fraction of an inch. I returned the gesture. Nothing more was needed. 2 men walking down a mountain road. Su Shan's right hand at his side, intact. The saber still at the terrace edge behind us. The Du family still a family. No longer a sponsor network. No longer a force in the national pipeline. The cumulative weight of it was heavier than cheer. A father had destroyed his son's cultivation in a conference hall 4 weeks ago. A family head had destroyed his own cultivation on his own terrace today. The transcendent figure status was earned through that accumulation rather than declared. The audience across the country would carry it forward in the form the country always carries such events. Half awe, half caution. A line spoken quietly for the next decade about the man you do not provoke. Su Shan did not speak on the road down. I let the silence hold. We reached the car at the foot of the compound, and we drove out of the valley, and I let the sky widen above the road until the ridges were behind us. The martial world had become the country. The country had its reference event. The next piece would be the one that came from outside the country, and the one who would move against me next would not be Chinese. But that was for Phase 10. For the road down off Longmen, the silence held, and Su Shan kept his right hand resting on his knee, and the saber at the terrace behind us stayed where it had fallen, and the sky over the Minshan Mountains stayed gray, the way an early winter sky stays gray when a long season has ended cleanly, and the next one has not yet begun. 3 weeks after Longmen, the country was quiet, the way a country gets quiet when a long sentence has ended, and the next one has not yet been spoken. Qinglong Pharmaceuticals distribution ran unopposed. The Chinese martial networks rehearsed the Longmen events the way networks rehearse a reference case, in lowered voices, at night, over tea. I stayed in the back mountain refuge with my parents for the first week, and in the Hangzhou manor for the second. Su Shui flew to Kunming on the 3rd week for a pharmaceutical distribution signing, a routine trip. the kind she had made dozens of times without a second thought. I was in the Qinglong inner courtyard at roughly 4 in the afternoon when the call came through. Su Shui had left her suite door at 9 in the morning for a scheduled elevator down to the conference floor. She had not arrived. Hotel surveillance had 11 seconds of a corridor disturbance. 3 figures in hospitality staff uniforms, one of them unusually tall, and then a compressed blur of displaced air the camera's frame rate could not resolve. Between the suite door and the elevator, she simply was not there. Her Su Group security detail had been posted at the stairwell and the lobby and had never registered movement. Her assistant had knocked on the suite door at 9:20 for a scheduled briefing, and the knock had been the first signal anything had happened. I stood in the inner courtyard with the phone against my ear, and I did not move. The Qinglong alert channels went live inside the next hour. Inside 2 hours, I had extended my Tangshuan key sensing lattice outward across Hangzhou and pinged through every jade-anchored operational perimeter I had laid in the delta over the previous year. The lattice returned nothing, not a signature, not a displacement, not a trace. The kidnap had been conducted through a key suppression artifact of Transformation Realm Southeast Asian craftwork. It did not block my sensing outright, it deferred it, masking the QI signature as ambient noise for approximately 6 hours. 6 hours was all the operator responsible had needed to move her out of mainland airspace. The operator was not Chinese. After Longman, no Chinese operator would touch the Su family. The extraction had come from outside the jurisdiction. I had held a specific stillness twice before in this life. Once, when I read the brief that said Jin Yuling had been taken. Once, when Xiao Zhan came down the ridge. The stillness I held in the inner courtyard was deeper than either. It was the stillness of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and was only waiting for his body to catch up with the decision. For the first and last time in the way I tell this story to myself, I could not breathe. The phrase is not a figure of speech. The breath actually stopped for the length of a long second. The courtyard's air did not move into my lungs, and I did not ask it to. Then the second passed, and the breath came back, and I put the phone down on the stone table, and I walked into the manor's private array room. On the central stone of the array room sat a small lacquered box. I had placed it there the day I moved into the Hangzhou manor. Inside the box was an object I had shaped over 2 afternoons in my study, 9 phases, and 1 long lifetime ago. Plumwood, the size of a thumbnail, inscribed with a single character, too fine to read without a lens. A gift for Su Shui the next time she came to the villa, I had told the housekeeper. She had thought it was a courtesy. It was not a courtesy. It was the paired half of the anchor I had given her for her grandfather's birthday, the one she had carried at her throat on a thin silver chain for more than a year. I picked up the paired half. I set it on my palm. I fed a thread of Tongsuan Qi into the grain of the wood. The reading arrived immediate and global. Su Shui was alive. Her pulse was steady. She was approximately 2,300 kilometers southwest of Hangzhou on a westerly vector, climbing at the altitude and speed of a private jet. The corridor of her movement mapped cleanly onto the Kunming, Yangon, Bangkok airlane. I did not need a second reading. I did not book commercial transport. I walked out of the array room and into the manor's outer courtyard, and by the time I had crossed the stone, the Qinglong executive aircraft I kept on standing standby at Hangzhou Field was being rolled out of its hangar. Qinglong Group held a pre-arranged diplomatic channel through Bangkok that the Su family had maintained for a decade. 4 hours after the first call into the inner courtyard, I was in the air. By the time the aircraft leveled over the South China Sea, Su Shan was already in Rayong with a boat and a crew, pre-positioned on an order I had sent him before I left the manor. I landed in Thailand at dawn of the next day. Xiaowang Suxi's intelligence network registered my arrival on the subcontinent inside the hour. By the time the ground vehicles met the aircraft, he had already pulled back to his primary stronghold, a fortified compound in the northern mountain region, built on top of a natural spiritual nexus, the local underworld called Shawang's Energy Mountain. Decades of key reservoir accumulated on top of an extant land feature, the foundation of his entire criminal operation and the source of his regional standing. I reached the outer perimeter of the compound at dawn on the second day. The outer guards stood in 3 tiers at the gate. They registered the Tongsuankui pressure at 30 meters, and none of them drew. Their hands went down and their shoulders went flat. I walked through the gate and past them. I did not look at their faces. Crossing the inner courtyard, I passed a ceremonial banyan tree rooted beside the compound's central shrine, a tree older than the compound itself, one of the trees the local tradition treated as a conductor of the nexus beneath. A fallen branch lay at the base of the trunk, where the night wind had brought it down. I picked the branch up. It was roughly the length of my forearm and a little warm from the morning sun. I carried the branch into the central shrine. The compression point of Shawang's energy mountain sat at the shrine's core, an incense altar built over an inscribed stone plate marking the nexus's surface node. Shawang Sukshi stood beside the altar in ceremonial robes. Two of his inner circle flanked him. The rest of his compound had taken up positions along the shrine walls with their weapons lowered because their weapons were not the first problem in the room. He opened by demanding, in his own language, and then in a Mandarin he had rehearsed for the occasion, that I kneel, that I destroy my cultivation on the altar stone in front of him, that I turn over every pill formula my name had been attached to in the regional rumor networks. His voice carried the bark of a man who had never in his life spoken a sentence to someone he was not sure he could break. I let him finish. I did not reply. I raised the branch in my right hand and I swung once. The swing had the economy of a thing the cultivation world would have called ordinary. The branch did not glow. It did not sing. It was a piece of fallen wood held by a hand that had once drawn the blood-red, soul-destroying sword through the Snake King on the flagstones of Qinglong Manor. The sword had been for a figure the cultivation world would have respected. The branch was for a regional bandit. The narration of my own head made that distinction clearly at the moment of the swing, and it made the distinction again afterward, so I would not forget it. The compression point detonated. Shawang's energy mountain, decades of reservoir, the land feature, the nexus node, the accumulated chi of a full generation of ceremonial practice, ruptured and went out of the Thai morning air like a lantern blown out by a long breath. The shrine walls did not fall. The altar stone cracked cleanly down the inscribed plate. Every cultivator inside the compound lost chi access at once, not dead, not wounded, not broken in the body, only emptied, as though a door they had been accustomed to walking through had been sealed without warning. They would be ordinary men for a span of weeks. Some of them would remain ordinary for the rest of their lives. Shawang Suchi was not killed. He was knelt. The rupture had taken his cultivation base the way a tide takes a line drawn in wet sand, completely, without visible force. He was stripped of the power that had made him a regional name. His inner circle lay on the shrine stones around him, conscious, breathing. I stepped forward to the altar and looked at him, and he did not raise his eyes from the floor. I spoke short, in Mandarin. I told him that Su Hui was alive, that she was on her way to Koh Samet, and that I would have her back inside the week. I told him that for the rest of his life, he was to remember the single branch and the single swing. I told him that a public corpse of a Southeast Asian power cultivator produced regional political consequences that slowed the recovery of the kidnapped, and that was the only reason he was still breathing on the shrine stones. A kneeling Shawang was a cautionary tale. A dead Shawang was a martyr and a catalyst. I did not want a martyr. I wanted a deterrent that lasted a generation. I dropped the branch on the altar stone beside the crack, and I walked out of the shrine without looking back. I crossed the northern border into central Thailand that afternoon through a mix of Qinglong-controlled vehicles and 2 short internal flights. The anchor's signal stabilized on Koh Samet by the evening of the 3rd day. Her pulse was still steady. She was holding. I reached Rayong the next morning. I took the harbor bar at the end of the short pier and waited for the boat across to the island. The bar was small, wooden, open to the water on one side, the sort of place where the bartender spoke 3 languages at a working level and asked nothing of the customers. I ordered a short drink and a bowl of rice. I paid in small notes. The anchor at my throat was warm. A low-tier local underworld enforcer named Mani came in through the harbor door after about 20 minutes. Mani was a thug on the payroll of one of Shawang's subsidiary holding operators, a man whose intelligence was still running 48 hours behind reality. The news of Shawang's fall had not yet propagated down to harbor-tier enforcers. Mani's operator had flagged me on an old ledger as a Chinese stranger with an outstanding bar tab, and Mani had come to collect. He walked up to my shoulder, and he said something unpleasant about the price of staying alive at the harbor and the price of staying alive in Rayong in general, and he reached for me. His hand came down on my shoulder. I was still talking to the bartender about the next boat schedule. I did not break the conversation. I slapped Mani with my left hand, once, with the calibrated pressure appropriate to a Tongsuan field touching an ordinary man. He came off his feet. He crossed 4 meters of floor, passed through the wooden bar table behind him, passed through the window behind the table, and landed on the harbor's stone pavement in a noise the bar did not hear twice because the harbor's stones were too far from the door. The bar went quiet. I finished paying my tab. I apologized to the bartender for the table and the window and asked him to pass a short line of apology to the window's owner. I left what I judged to be the proper cash on the counter for both. The bartender took the cash and nodded and did not look at the window. I walked out through the harbor door and down the pier and stepped onto the boat. The boat crossed to Koh Summit under a sky going copper at the edges of the sea. I watched the island come up out of the water. The Boxing King's Hall sat on the eastern cliff face in 3 tiers carved into the rock, and its topmost tier was lit against the sunset the way an arena is lit on a fight night. The tracking anchor's signal strengthened as the boat crossed the narrow strait. Su Hui was in the lowest tier. She was conscious. Her pulse had not changed. I arrived at the island as the evening's first fight card was being announced over the arena's amplification. The cliff's stone stairway climbed from the harbor in a long flight cut into the rock. I walked up it at an ordinary pace. The Boxing King's Hall's main gate sat at the top of the stairway under a carved stone lintel. 2 mid-tier transformation realm fighters stood on standing duty at the gate. They had received a Shawang alert 4 hours earlier and a set of contradictory orders from Koh Summit's resident operator in the hour since: contain, do not engage, and their hands went down at their sides and stayed there. I walked past them without slowing. Inside the main arena, the card was halfway through its announcement. I walked through the gallery and up to the promoter's booth. The promoter was a man in his 50s, ringed by 5 transformation realm attendants. Through a short exchange in Mandarin and translated Thai, I told him the night's scheduled fights were concluded and the holding cells were to be opened. He refused. I raised one hand. The QE pressure field of the promoter's booth collapsed. Not in the way a room collapses when its walls give way. In the way a small pressurized volume collapses when the pressure outside exceeds its containment. The 5 attendants dropped at once without visible contact, alive, unconscious before their knees touched the floor. The promoter stayed upright because he was upright in a chair the attendants had been standing in front of. His face had gone white and his hands were flat on the table in front of him. He said something that sounded like a question. I said, "The cells." He reached for a key at his belt and he walked me to the descending stairway. I went down through 3 cell tiers of the cliff-carved compound. The anchor's signal strengthened at every level. On the 3rd and lowest tier, the corridor ran along a stone passage cut into the cliff, with arched cell doors spaced at intervals along its length. And in the 4th cell from the end, the signal centered and stopped. The door opened on Su Shui. She was conscious. She was unharmed. She was wearing the same plain traveling dress she had left Kunming in, and her hair was still tied back the way she tied it before a morning briefing. The silver chain at her throat was intact, and the plumwood anchor hung from it exactly where it had hung for a year. She stood up when the cell door opened. She did not cry. She had spent 4 days knowing, with certainty, that I was coming. The certainty was the quiet she had held onto. The crying was for surprises, and this was not a surprise. She looked at me, and her mouth did the small thing it did when she was not going to speak. I held out my hand. She took it. The hand was small and cool, and held mine with the pressure of a woman who had not slept in 4 days and would not admit it. I did not speak the word. I did not speak it in the cell. I did not speak it on the stone stairway, climbing back out of the tiers. I did not speak it crossing the gallery, or the main arena, or passing the promoter's booth, where the 5 attendants were still unconscious on the floor, and the promoter was still upright at his table, with his hands flat on the wood. I did not speak it at the gate, where the 2 standing duty guards did not look at us as we passed. The word belonged to another life and another woman, and until that life closed, I would not put it down on this one. 5 transformation realm fighters took up positions on the escape route between the arena and the stone stairway. I dispatched them in sequence the way I had dispatched the Snake King on the Qinglong flagstones, with the compression the old language called a mountain falling, reduced to the size of a single engagement and applied one at a time. Each fight was a beat. 1. A spear hand line, coming in at shoulder height, the line broken at the wrist, the man flat on the gallery stone. 2. A curved blade swung on the opposite angle, the blade in 2 pieces on the tiles, the man beside it. 3. A key pressure fist, compressed at the center of my sternum, dispersed an inch from my robe, the man's arm arrested above his head. 4. A double strike timed off a pillar, the pillar cracked through. the man beside it. 5. A long staff coming down at the height of my head, the staff in splinters, the man on his back. By the time we reached the clifftop stairway, the Boxing King's Hall as an institution had lost its security layer. We walked down the stone stairway in silence. The galleries above us watched from the arena windows and did not speak and did not move. Her hand was in mine for the full descent. The stairway was long, and the night had gone full dark over the eastern shore of Koh Samet. By the time we reached the harbor, Sushan was on the boat. He had been waiting at the harbor since an hour before midnight on a signal I had sent him from the island the moment I crossed the gate. The boat was small and fast, and Qinglong registered. He did not speak when we stepped onto the deck. He nodded once to Su Shui, once to me, and he turned the boat out into the water and pointed it back toward the Thai coast. The island receded behind us under a clear night sky. I sat on the deck with my back against the cabin wall. Su Hui sat beside me. The engine held its note at the stern, and the stars came up through the thinner air over the strait. Her hand was resting on her knee. My hand was resting on the deck between us. Her hand moved across the 2 inches of deck. It touched the back of mine. Briefly, the contact was the length of a single breath. She did not look at me when she did it. I did not look at her. Somewhere in Thailand, the Southeast Asian underworld was already rearranging its standing against the events of the previous 72 hours. Somewhere in China, the Marshall networks were registering the second tremor of a year, in which the country's reference case had been set twice. The word the narration might have used sat in the air above the deck and did not come down. Her hand stayed on mine for the length of one breath. Then it moved back to her knee. Neither of us spoke for the rest of the crossing. The night was clear, and the anchor at her throat was still warm from my palm, and the island behind us kept going smaller until it was a single dark line at the edge of the dark water, and then it was not there. The boat from Rayong crossed the strait in the last hour before dawn, and the Qinglong executive aircraft lifted us out of Bangkok through the same pre-arranged diplomatic channel that had flown us in. Su Shui slept for the first hour of the flight, with her head against the cabin wall and her hand in mine. By the time we came down over Hangzhou, the sun was over the delta, and Su Shan had a second car waiting on the field. I brought Su Shui home the way a man brings water back to a cup that had been turned upside down for 4 days. Su Hongyuan met us at the foot of the Qinglong Drive. He did not speak. He touched his granddaughter's shoulder once, and then stepped back and let her go up to her grandfather's wing ahead of him. The Su family compound moved into a soft, defensive posture for the week that followed. Personal physicians in and out, a reduced calendar, a kitchen running at her mother's quiet direction. I sat with her parents at a private dinner that evening, at which very little was said and very little needed to be. Her father looked at me across the table exactly once, for the length of a held breath, and then looked down at his rice. That was the whole conversation. I walked back up the hill to the Qinglong Manor under a clean autumn sky, and I went into seclusion inside the inner array for 9 days. The seclusion was not advancement, it was maintenance. The energy mountain rupture at Shawang's northern compound had drawn on the upper stratum of my Tongsuan reservoir, and the 5 transformation realm dispatches along the Boxing King's Hall gallery, and the pressure collapse at the promoter's booth had drawn on it again before the reservoir had been given any room to settle. Tongsuan is a realm with strata inside it. I was now operating in its upper stratum, and an upper stratum that has not been stabilized is a roof built on new mortar and then immediately walked across. The next realm ceiling beyond Tongsuan was not reachable on Earth without resources Earth no longer possessed. Tongsuan had already registered on seismic stations across 3 provinces when I broke into it. Whatever came after Tongsuan would need a node condition this world did not have. I sat inside the array, and I let the reservoir settle. Jin Yuling held the outer perimeter through all 9 days. She had returned to Qinglong during the week of Phase 10, stationed at the manor with my parents and with Su Hongyuan at her back, and she stayed on the perimeter now without a word of instruction from me. She was at Foundation establishment, and she kept a clean, disciplined watch. The narration can rest here for a paragraph. The audience needs the breath. 9 days inside the array, the reservoir held. I came out on the morning of the 10th day to find Gu Dongqing waiting in the outer courtyard. It had been over a year since Gu Dongqing had come to Qinglong. The old easy embarrassment was still in his face. The particular mix of warmth and caution he had worn every time he had been the only person at a college table who had not joined the rest of them in laughing at me. He had a man with him I did not know. mid-30s, drawn-faced, standing a careful step behind Gu Dongqing's right shoulder. In the man's hands was a small wooden box, plainly made, older than either of them. Gu Dongqing introduced him. "Lin Luo," he said. "This is my friend, Zhao Wenjie. His father is dying." And then, because Gu Dongqing had understood by now exactly what I was and what kind of favor he was asking, he added, "I told him the only person who could help was you." Zhao Wenjie stepped forward. He was a medical researcher by training. I could see the hospital's habit in the way he stood, and he had spent a long, careful time rehearsing the sentences he was about to use. His father had liver failure compounded with what no modern hospital could identify, and what I recognized at a glance as a hereditary spiritual root corruption sleeping in the bloodline for 3 generations. Zhao Wenjie had eliminated every conventional option. He had come through Gu Dongqing because Gu Dongqing had told him, carefully, that he had a friend. He opened the box. Cushioned in old silk, paler than the wood of the box, and darker than jade ought to be, was a stone the size of my palm. A 1,000-year natural spirit jade. The specific shade of green that identifies the age bracket. The green that has drunk light for centuries and given it back as a colder color. Cold qi resonance coming off the surface in a slow, even pulse. The old Zhao family had held it for 4 generations, passed down from a great-great-grandfather who had been a minor Qing-era cultivator, and they had held it without ever knowing what it was. Above a mantelpiece, beside a photograph, for 100 years. Zhao Wenjie did not know what he was offering. He was offering the most valuable thing his family had ever kept, because Gu Dongqing, briefing him before the visit, had told him to bring the most valuable object in the house. I kept my face flat. I let the silence hold the room for a beat longer than was comfortable. The jade's age bracket made it exactly the stabilization substrate my upper stratum Tongsuan reservoir required to anchor, the last functional resource of that grade left on Earth. The irony was that if Zhao Wenjie had known, he would have asked for anything else first. "I accept," I said, and I said it in a register that made the trade sound like a trade and not a favor. Zhao Wenjie was a man in the last days of his father's life. He did not need a second debt on top of the first. "I will cure your father this evening. The jade is payment in full, Mr. Lin," Zhao Wenjie said, and the relief in his voice caught at the edges of his words. "Thank you." "Thank Gu Dongqing," I said. We drove out to the Zhao estate in Guangzhou that afternoon. I cured Zhao Wenjie's father in the back room of the old compound, in a procedure that took a little over 2 hours. 3 of the mid-grade pills from the Qinglong Inner Reserve, 30 minutes of meridian guidance channeled through the Fengmen and the Dazhui points, and a careful burn of the spiritual root corruption at the seat of the old Qing-era inheritance. The elder Zhao vomited a thin black fluid twice and then slept. Within 72 hours, he walked down his own stairs for the first time in a year. The Zhao family as a whole, stunned and grateful, attached itself informally to the Qinglong distribution network the week after. Gu Dongqing walked me to the car on our way out of the Zhao estate. He did not ask what the jade was. He knew, without needing to ask, that I would never have accepted a payment that was anything less than fair. He half bowed at the car door and said quietly, "Brother Luo, I owed you before I brought him. I still owe you. We are brothers," I said. "There is no debt between us. There never was." He smiled the quick, sincere smile I remembered from a decade of dining hall meals and said nothing else. The friendship the narration had been tracking since the Phase 2 reunion closed itself cleanly that afternoon, the way a door closes when the house behind it is finally warm. The jade went into the Qinglong array that night as a permanent stabilization anchor. The reservoir took it and held. There was one thing left on the regional board. The Qinling Mountains still carried a cluster of mid-tier martial and cultivation sects that had not yet formally acknowledged the position Qinglong had taken after Longmen. The serious opposition in China was behind me. What remained in Qinling was paperwork and symbolism, old lineages that required face-to-face acknowledgement of seniority to close the file without reopening old grievances. A remote message would have read as dismissal and would have left grudges breathing for another generation. Cultivation regions have grammar. Qinling's grammar required a visit on the ground. I took Jin Yuling with me. She was back in the field for the first time since Phase 10, and she was months from her qi refinement threshold, and I had a teacher's reason and a commander's reason to want her beside me on the road. The teacher's reason was that the threshold was closer than she thought and would open through theoretical clarity more than through reservoir accumulation. The commander's reason was that a visible senior disciple propagates a message about lineage that no announcement can. We left the manor on a clear morning. I had chosen to travel overland. The slowness was the point. The 10 days of that travel were the warmest the narration had allowed itself since my parents' early months at Qinglong. A minor Sichuan clan's heir, attempted a face-saving confrontation at a mountain tea house on the third day. He arrived with 2 retainers in the old travel robes clans still wore for these occasions, and he announced a challenge he had rehearsed all morning. I let him finish. I answered him in 3 sentences that dismissed the challenge, preserved his clan's face, and sent him home with a record of the attempt. His retainers bowed. He bowed after them. By the time we left the tea house, the whole incident had already compressed itself into the kind of paragraph the regional chronicles tuck into a footnote. A rogue grandmaster who had spent 2 years operating out of a cave retreat near Xi'an heard of our approach on the 5th day and left the province before we arrived. His morning briefing had tracked my position since Longmen. He chose the door that stayed open. I did not follow him. A political adjacent sect elder on the 7th day requested a private audience at his own estate to pledge alignment with the Qinglong position. I granted it. The audience lasted 20 minutes. He was older than he looked and careful, and he asked for exactly the right amount of nothing. I left his estate with his pledge formal and his dignity intact. These 3 encounters were paragraphs in the shape of the journey, not beats in the shape of the phase. The serious fights were over. Between them, Jin Yuling pressed me on foundation establishment to qi refinement theoretical substrate every evening by the roadside fire. Master, she said on the 4th evening, a cup of tea between her hands and the fire low. The qi refinement threshold is described in the old manuals as the moment the practitioner stops counting breaths and begins counting intervals between breaths. What does that mean? It means, I said, that foundation establishment is still breath work. Qi refinement is rhythm work. The breath becomes a unit you use to measure something else. When you can measure the interval without counting the breath, you are through. She thought about that for a long, quiet moment. Then she nodded once and drank her tea. On the 7th evening, she asked a question that told me the threshold was closer than months. I did not tell her yet. She would cross it when she crossed it. The road did the rest of the work. We came down into the Qinling foothills on the morning of the 11th day. Tang Hai was waiting at the primary compound, a Tang adjacent but independent grandmaster's estate, carved into the hillside above the tree line, old stone and black tile, concrete pillars holding up a main hall with a long, smoothed floor. Tang Hai was 70 years old, transformation realm, and proud enough that the Longmen precedent had not reached him the way it had reached the rest of the region. He had spent the week since my approach was announced, preparing a formal challenge of the kind the Chinese martial world had not seen issued in a generation. He received us in the main hall. He did not rise. His demand came without preamble. He delivered it the way an old grandmaster delivered a demand when he had built his whole internal model around the idea that grandmaster to grandmaster challenges were formal opening positions. Paraphrased, because his dialogue was paraphrased, the way all such dialogue had been for 10 phases now. He required that I cut off my own leg and surrender my cultivation base on his hall's stone floor as the penalty for presuming senior status inside Qinling jurisdiction. He had, I could see in the set of his shoulders, prepared a graduated acceptable settlement ladder behind the opening position. He expected me to counteroffer. I did not counteroffer. I took one step forward inside the main hall. The concrete pillar holding the hall's western wall stood 3 meters to Tang Hai's left. I looked at the pillar. I did not look at Tang Hai. I threw one punch. The punch did not touch Tang Hai. The punch was not aimed at Tang Hai. Tongsuan Qi, shaped into a directed compression beam, passes through organic matter harmlessly at a designated angle and breaks structural crystalline composition on its path. The beam crossed the 3 meters between my fist and the pillar without raising a hair on Tang Hai's head. The pillar disintegrated. The wall behind it disintegrated. The hall's western face opened into a concussive cloud of concrete dust, and the morning sky came through the gap where the wall had been. Tang Hai had not moved. He stood exactly where he had stood when he delivered his demand, and he could not stop himself from understanding what the punch would have done had it been aimed at him. I watched the understanding arrive behind his eyes. It arrived in a single motion, the way a wave arrives. He sat down on the stone floor. He did not speak for 3 minutes. The dust settled around his shoulders. His retinue, which had been arrayed along the hall's inner wall, did not move. Jin Yuling stood 1 pace behind me with her hands at her sides. The morning air came through the new opening in the western wall and crossed the hall in a long, slow draft. 3 minutes is the time a 70-year martial identity needs to accept an update without snapping. When he finally spoke, he did so with the dignity that belongs only to a man who has just watched his own ceiling be shown to him in 3 seconds. The demand was withdrawn. The challenge was rescinded. He asked only, paraphrased, because he was still Tang Hai, and Tang Hai's words still belonged to the paraphrase register, that the matter now be taken up with Tang Yuanwu of the senior Tang sect at Longmen, a related but formally independent clan, who would be authorized to negotiate his alignment on terms Tang Hai could not negotiate from the stone floor of a hall whose western wall was now open to the sky. I agreed. Jin Yuling and I walked out of the main hall through the collapsed western wall and into the open morning. The estate's outer retinue watched from their stations along the inner courtyard and did not move. The hall behind us stood with Tang Hai still seated on its floor. Within 24 hours, Tang Yuanwu at Longmen would receive the full account, and the context of the concrete wall would already be in the room before I arrived. Jin Yuling did not speak until we were through the outer gate and on the road down. "Master," she said, "you did not hit him." "No," I said, "I did not." She thought about that for a long time as we walked. The Qinling foothills opened out below us, with the full morning coming up across the valleys. The punch aimed past a man is colder than a punch aimed at him. Mercy calibrated to dignity reads, to the man it is calibrated for, as the only register left he can answer in. I had chosen the single gesture that closed the framework instead of entering the graduated ladder. The framework was closed. We walked down the road toward Longmen, with the jade at the center of the Qinglong array still holding at my back, and the reservoir steady in my chest, and Jin Yuling one quiet pace beside me. Earth had given me, by the end of that day, approximately everything Earth could give. The Tang sect at Longmen was the last piece, and the Tang sect at Longmen, Tang Yuanwu would later tell me himself, had been watching the Qinling Road since the morning the dust settled on the western wall. 3 days after the western wall of Tang Hai's main hall settled into dust, Jin Yuling and I rode into Longmen. The town carried its own recent memory. It was the same town where Du Yiyang had walked himself to the edge of his own reservoir in front of a national audience and crippled himself with his own family saber. Tang Yuanwu had chosen Longmen for the meeting, and I had agreed to it because both of us understood what the choice said. The Tang sect at Longmen was not going to pretend the Du family precedent had not happened. Neither was I. The Tang sect compound sat on a low rise at the eastern edge of the town, built the way old sects still built, walled courtyards in sequence, the central hall at the third courtyard, banners along the inner walls, 2 wings of seated elders in dark silk tunics, and the sect's internal disciples arrayed down the wings in tidy parallel rows. Tang Yuanwu received us at the gate of the first courtyard with full sect head protocol. He was in his late 60s, tall for his generation, gray-bearded, and he wore the senior grandmaster's robe of the Tang lineage without any of the anxiety I had expected a man in his position to carry. I had come to Longmen rather than summoning him to Qinglong deliberately. A sect head summoned to another man's compound becomes a supplicant in the grammar of his own institution, and Tang Yuanwu would not have been able to negotiate alignment on terms his own elders could later ratify. The visit was the alignment's first condition. Tang Yuanwu understood that I understood it. That was most of the work already done. He did not pretend to ignorance of what I was. He dismissed the Tang Hai incident in 3 careful sentences: old generation, outdated reading of the national landscape, no bearing on the present meeting, and moved on. His real interest, framed politely across the long lacquered table in the central hall, was the substantive alignment of the Tang sect with Qinglong Pharmaceutical, distribution rights through Tang sect channels, pharmaceutical research cooperation, defensive aid mutuality in the provinces where Tang sect influence still ran deep, and, unspoken but clear in the set of the room, the question of whether the Tang sect might be permitted to place disciples within my personal lineage. Before he asked, though, he asked for something else. Shadowless 3 Blades. He used the name directly. I had not chosen the name. I had never named the technique to anyone, but the technique analysts of the Chinese martial world had reconstructed its general form from its deployments across the Snake King courtyard, the Longmen platform, and the Ko-Samet corridor, and they had given it the name that now sat in every sect's internal briefing document. Tang Yuanwu asked for a demonstration in a private courtyard, witnessed by only his sect elders. He framed the request as pedagogical. His sect's internal teaching tradition required that senior students be shown visible examples of the next tier's technique, and my name, he said plainly, had become the relevant tier. A private demonstration travels as verified rumor through a sect's teaching network in a more usable form than a public spectacle does. I agreed. The private courtyard was small, perhaps 20 meters on a side, stone paved, a single old cherry tree at the eastern edge, with late leaves still holding. The elders took their seats along the perimeter. At the back edge of the courtyard, not yet introduced, stood 2 disciples in plain, dark sect robes. A young man, lean, steady-eyed. A young woman, shorter, square-jawed, composed. Tang Feng and Tang Yin. I did not learn the names until after. I stepped into the courtyard's center. Shadowless 3 blades, in its public-facing form, is a 3-stage compression technique. Tungsuan Qi shaped into 3 successive cutting planes, each delivered in a single motion, each oriented 90 degrees to the one before, each holding through crystalline structure at up to 10 meters. The mathematics of it requires 3 blades, because 3 orthogonal dimensions is the minimum geometry in which you can produce cuts in every axis of a stone at once. The number is not symbolic, it is just the minimum. At the courtyard's 3 compass points, 3 stone practice targets had been set up for the demonstration. I breathed once. The first blade left my palm like a breath leaving it. The second folded across the first. The third closed across the second. The whole sequence took something under 4 seconds. At the northern target, the stone separated into halves. At the southern target, thirds. At the eastern target, quarters. The cut faces were so thin and so smooth that for a full second, the separated pieces stood against each other under their own adhesion, as if nothing had happened, and then atmospheric pressure noticed the separation, and the pieces fell apart in slow, deliberate silence. One of the elders along the perimeter tightened his hand on his robe sleeve. I saw it and looked away. Tang Yuanwu stood. He did not pretend to be unaffected. He took a breath, regathered himself, and introduced the 2 disciples, formally, their lineages, their cultivation standings, both solid foundation establishment, their aptitude readings, which the Tang sect's internal instructors had judged suitable for Qi refinement under proper instruction, their written consent to discipleship under my personal lineage, signed that morning in advance of the demonstration. Tang Feng stepped forward first, then Tang Yin. They knelt together on the cold stone. I accepted them both. Jin Yuling, standing at the courtyard's eastern edge, bowed once to her new junior disciple siblings. The bow was exactly the right depth. My lineage, which had been 1 person for 4 phases, became 3 people in the space of a quiet afternoon in a Longmen courtyard. Tang Wanwu and I signed the alignment agreement with the Tang sect that same evening. Distribution, research, mutual defense. The agreement ran to 11 pages, and nobody at the table asked for a revision. I left Longmen the next morning with 2 more disciples than I had arrived with, and with the last major sect of central China formally aligned behind my position. What followed was a fortnight I will describe only in the rhythm it deserves. Tang Feng and Tang Yin rode with us. Jin Yuling took them in hand on the road the way a senior disciple should, with quiet firmness and without showing off. I gave the 3 of them short daily instruction in the travel intervals, foundational breathwork in the mornings, reservoir hygiene in the afternoons, meditation by the evening fire. Tang Feng listened with the stillness of a man who had already rebuilt his expectations twice that week. Tang Yin listened with the steadier attention of someone whose internal weather had never needed to be rebuilt in the first place. A sect head in Chengdu bowed across the low table of a tea house courtyard and handed me a written pledge of alignment that had been drafted without the need for any words spoken aloud. A young clan head in Fuzhou presented his pledge at a harbor villa at sunset and accepted a cup of my poured tea in return. An elderly retired grandmaster in Nanjing, who had not emerged from his private residence for a political meeting in 15 years, offered me tea at his own table as acknowledgement rather than submission. I accepted the tea and did not press him further. Each scene was a paragraph. The shape across all of them was the shape of an empire finishing itself. On the 18th day, 2 provinces from Hangzhou, the brief reached me. Sushan's intelligence network filed it at dusk. 1 sheet, folded twice. Mu Mankang of the Mu clan had emerged from 50 continuous years of formal seclusion. His clan, struggling for relevance in the post-Longmen landscape, had petitioned him directly to return from his mountain retreat and engage the Qinglong question in person. The brief estimated his approach route. The timing put him at the gates of Qinglong Manor within 36 hours. I read the sheet once, folded it, and handed it back. We returned to Qinglong Manor in the final light of the 20th day. I arrived at the outer gate at dusk. The light over the Hangzhou hills had gone the soft copper color late autumn gives the delta at that hour, and the air inside the manor's inner grounds was already beginning to shift in the specific register that precedes a grandmaster's arrival, a slow pressure building against the edges of the array, the way weather changes against the edges of a room. The array had sensed him before I had. He came up the path at full dusk, on foot, alone, ancient and thin, white hair combed back, deep gray formal robes cut in the old Mu clan seclusion tradition, no visible weapon. His key signature, released incrementally as he approached the inner gate, read as Peak Transformation Realm, not above Tongsuan, but the most deeply and formally trained representative of the pre-Tongsuan ceiling that the mortal world had ever produced. 50 years of seclusion compressed into a single walk up a Hangzhou path. I met him in the inner courtyard, beside the Spirit Gathering Array's center stone, the same courtyard in which, more than a year ago now, I had killed the Snake King with one sword stroke. Jin Yuling took position at the courtyard's western edge, Tang Feng and Tang Yin at the eastern. Su Shan stood at the inner gate with Su Hui at his shoulder. I had invited her directly, and she had come without asking why. My parents watched from the manor's upper balcony. I could feel my mother's hand on the railing without looking up. Mu Mankang delivered his demand without preamble. He delivered it the way a man reads contract terms. I will paraphrase, because his dialogue, like all such dialogue, comes through my narration. He required that I kneel on the courtyard stones before him, that I acknowledge the Mu clan's seniority in the national cultivation hierarchy, that I surrender every cultivation world technique record I had brought back into this world to the Mu clan archive, and that I serve as senior advisor to the Mu clan for a period of 30 years. The traditional term of cross-clan obligation in the old grammar, he had last closed his eyes inside. His voice was even. His cultivation discipline had left him unable to update the model of the world he had held 50 years ago, and he was reading the demand from inside that model as if the model still described the room he was standing in. I did not raise my voice. No, I said, I will not. 3 words, formal, delivered in the register of a man who had long since stopped needing more than 3 words for this kind of exchange. Mu Mankang's expression moved across one precise microbeat. Then he channeled a measured portion of his 50-year accumulated reservoir into the stone armchair standing at the courtyard's edge behind him, and the armchair crumbled into coarse gravel without his touching it. He meant the gesture as the opening of a graduated confrontation. He expected a counter demonstration from me. He did not get one. What he got instead was the longest sustained passage of speech I had delivered in either of my lives. I spoke for something close to 90 seconds. I did not insult him. I did not threaten him. I described the room. I described his 50 years and the discipline it had required, and the world that discipline had been preparing him for. And then I described the world that actually existed outside his pavilion gate. The Longmen precedent, the Du family's withdrawal on that platform in front of a national audience, the Snake King dead in this same courtyard in a single sword stroke, the Tang sect at Longmen aligned 3 weeks ago. The Tongsuan reservoir that Earth's seismic stations had already registered in 3 provinces. None of it was said in the register of boasting. All of it was said in the register of a senior telling an old friend where the road went. And then, toward the end, I named the things I had spent 10 phases not naming aloud. I named the cultivation world as the realm above this one, and I said plainly that the confrontation he was inviting inside this courtyard tonight was a confrontation I would not allow to delay the door I was already walking toward. I said the name Qinruo Shui, her name in my own voice for the first time in either of my lives. I had taken Zhang Chuan's face for speaking it. I spoke it now myself, because the world needed to hear where I was going. I said the Huang family as the reason I was going there. I said both names quietly. I did not raise either of them to the register of grievance. I placed them into the room as the priorities that Earth's martial hierarchy would not be permitted to stand in front of. I offered Mu Mankang a formal forward date, 3 months from that evening, a neutral venue. He could withdraw the challenge before the date if his clan's petitioners reconsidered what they had asked him to do. He could keep the date if they did not. Either way, tonight was not the night, and Qinglong Manor, my parents visible on the balcony above us, Su Shui at the inner gate, was not the place. Mu Mankang stood in silence after I finished. The silence ran the exact length of dusk, becoming full dark. The array's stones cooled under the sky. None of the witnesses at the courtyard's edges moved. He accepted the date. He turned to leave. At the outer gate he paused, turned back, and looked at me across the path one last time. He acknowledged, in a single short sentence, that I will paraphrase here rather than perform, that in 50 years of seclusion and a full martial life before that seclusion, he had never before encountered a man whose refusal of a demand contained less fear than mine had. Then he stepped through the gate and was gone down the dark path. The narration pulled back. I stood in the inner courtyard beside the Spirit Gathering Array's center stone, Jin Yuling at the western edge, Tangfeng and Tangyin at the eastern, Sushan at the inner gate, quiet, watching the gate Mumankang had passed through, Su Shui beside him, my parents on the balcony above, my mother's hand still on the railing, my father's hand resting lightly on my mother's shoulder. The manor grounds held the cooling air of a late autumn evening that had decided, somewhere in the last hour, to become the first clear cold night of the coming winter. I looked up. The Hangzhou night sky over the manor had come through into full dark while I had been speaking. A clear sky, the first stars sharp at the edges, no cloud. The sky was wide in the way skies are wide when the eye is the one that has been broadened. The Earthside Empire was done. The last sect aligned, the last clan acknowledged, the last old generation grandmaster turned at my gate. Mumankang's 3-month date stood as the one open door behind me, a door I could close on my own schedule now and not on his. The door ahead of me was the other one, the gate above, the cultivation world, and Qin Roshui, whose name I had carried in silence across a decade of 2 lives and had finally said aloud in my own voice tonight, had waited long enough. I was almost ready to come.